Before we dive into the next exciting story, drop a comment below and let me know what time is it where you're watching from. I'm curious to see where everyone's tuning in from around the world.
I remember the first night like it was a whisper fading into the dark. Soft, unsettling, but almost easy to ignore. Yellowstone, they say, is a land of wonders. But it's also a place where the wilderness doesn't just surround you. It presses in, shifts, watches, and sometimes it speaks. Not in words, but in sounds that don't quite fit, in shadows that move just beyond your eyes, in the cold brush of wind that feels like a breath on your neck when no one else is there. I learned that lesson slowly, painfully, the way you learn the hard way, through moments you want to believe are tricks of the mind but can't be shaken, no matter how hard you try. We arrived late afternoon, me and my friend Sarah. She was 29, sharp and tough. Grew up on a ranch just outside Cody, Wyoming. She knew Yellowstone better than most visitors. Local kids had their own ways of understanding the park. Stories passed down about places where people disappeared or where the land seemed to shift overnight. We chose a spot near the edge of the forest by Yellowstone Lake, a quiet, less crowded campground called Bridge Bay. Perfect for what we wanted: peace, space, and a chance to escape the noise of the city in our old rust-speckled RV. The air was crisp, a bite of early fall creeping into the pine needles. I remember how the smell of damp earth mixed with the faint scent of wood smoke from distant campfires settled into my bones as we set up. We were careful, double-checking our campsite, securing food in the bear lockers. We joked about the bears like tourists do. Don't let the bears eat you, right? But Sarah's eyes always flickered with something else. Wariness, maybe. She warned me to trust the quiet, to listen not just to what we saw, but what we didn't. That night, I lay awake in the RV, the curtains pulled tight, but the sounds outside bleeding through the thin walls. At first, it was the usual: the rustle of trees, the distant howl of a coyote, the occasional crack of a twig. But then something changed. A rhythm emerged, slow and deliberate. Soft knocks, spaced like a heartbeat, tapping somewhere near the back of the RV. I told myself it was a branch hitting the trailer, or an animal curious enough to investigate. But the knocking kept coming, steady and unyielding, like someone was trying to get in, but didn't want to scare me away completely. I tried to ignore it, rolling over, telling myself I was just tired. Sarah was asleep across the room, breathing steady and calm. But the sound stuck with me. And somewhere between that half-sleep, half-wake state, I heard something else, something beneath the knocking. A low, guttural murmur, like whispers just out of reach, threading through the night air like smoke. By morning, I wasn't sure what had been real and what was dream. Sarah teased me about it, said I probably just needed more coffee. But as we sat by the lake, the surface glassy and cold, she told me her own story, a tale about Heckmerper, who vanished near this very spot years ago. No trace, no clues, just a campsite left open and empty, with a campfire still warm. She said the park rangers never really explained what happened, but locals called it the Whispering Ground. She said if you listened too closely at night, the forest would talk back, and sometimes it wouldn't like what you had to say. I laughed it off then, but inside, a thread of unease tightened. There was a strange stillness around us, a weight pressing down that afternoon. The wind, which had promised cool relief, turned sharp and biting. I noticed how the birds stopped singing. The squirrels froze, watching us from a distance with eyes too bright and too knowing. That night, things got worse. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the smell of something rotten, thick and sour, like something dead but not quite gone. The RV felt cold, much colder than it should have been. My skin prickled, hairs standing on edge as I heard that tapping again, this time on the door. I swallowed hard and, ignoring the voice in my head yelling to stay still, I reached for the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the door's scratched surface. Outside, the shadow of a figure flitted just beyond the trees, tall and thin, impossibly still. My heart hammered, but when I blinked, it was gone. Only the wind moved then, carrying with it a sound like breathing, slow, deliberate, almost human. I woke Sarah, whispering, but she hushed me. "Don't," she said. "You're seeing what you want to see. It's the park, it plays tricks." But I wasn't so sure anymore. The next day, we tried to shake it off. We hiked, keeping the sun on our faces, chasing the warm yellow light away from the shadowed forest edges. But even in the brightness, the feeling didn't fade. The trees seemed to lean in, watching. The earth beneath our boots felt loose, as if it might swallow us whole if we weren't careful. When we returned to camp, the bear lockers were ripped open, food gone, but no footprints or signs of how the bear got in. Sarah's jaw tightened. "That's not normal," she muttered. "Bears don't sneak in like thieves." I nodded, my mind running wild with thoughts I refused to voice. What else was out there? What had we disturbed? That night, I didn't sleep. The knocking returned, louder now, more insistent. This time, I knew it wasn't a branch or animal. It was something else. I stood at the door, flashlight raised, breath frozen in my throat. "Who's there?" I called, voice cracking. No answer, just the silence that followed was enough to make my skin crawl. We packed up before dawn, driving out with headlights cutting through a fog that had crept in overnight, thick and clinging like a shroud. On the road back, Sarah looked over at me and said quietly, "Yellowstone isn't just a park. It's alive, and sometimes it's angry." I carried that feeling with me long after the trip ended. The invisible eyes watching, the forest, whispering secrets in a language older than any of us. I learned to respect that quiet dread, to listen to the warning signs the land gives when you think no one's looking. RV camping in Yellowstone isn't just about trails and scenery. It's about survival, trust, and knowing when to walk away before the darkness closes in. Because some dangers don't roar or show their teeth. They wait, patient and unseen, in the silence between the stars. The morning fog wrapped around us like a wet blanket as we drove away from Bridge Bay. Even as the sun climbed, the mist clung stubbornly to the treetops, swallowing the road ahead in a ghostly shroud. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was trailing us. Something slow and patient, watching from the shadowed edges of those ancient pines. Sarah kept her eyes on the road, jaw tight, her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles blanched. I wanted to ask her what she knew, what she wasn't saying. But some truths have no easy words, especially when they come from a place you never want to admit is real. We ended up at a different campground that afternoon, farther south near West Thumb, hoping for fresh air and a break from the oppressive weight of that first night. The area was more open here, the geysers steaming like giant breathing monsters from the earth, their hissing whispers filling the silence. It was beautiful, almost mesmerizing, but the sounds had a different tone. The sharp hiss and crackle beneath the stillness felt like warnings, not welcomes. As we set up the RV, I noticed the animals acting strangely again. Birds flitted erratically, their calls sharp and discordant, and the usual chipmunks and squirrels stayed hidden, their eyes nervously tracking us from behind rocks and tree trunks. The forest here didn't feel alive. It felt watchful, alert to something just beyond the visible. That night, the wind brought with it a faint, rotten scent again. It wasn't as strong as before, but enough to make the back of my neck prickle. I told myself it was just sulfur from the geothermal activity, the smell of the earth itself. But the tight knot in my stomach said otherwise. I lay awake, watching shadows dance on the walls of the RV as branches scraped outside like fingernails tracing patterns against the windows. Then came the tapping again, this time from the roof. Slow, deliberate knocks, as if something was pacing up there, waiting, listening. I wanted to believe it was a bear or some restless animal, but my mind kept racing back to the stories Sarah told. The vanished camper, the whispers, the angry spirits said to roam the park at night. I tried to rationalize, to brush it off, but the fear grew like a slow-burning ember beneath my skin. "Sarah," I whispered, shaking her gently. She stirred, groggy, blinking against the dark. "Do you hear that?" She frowned, listening. The tapping continued, steady and unrelenting. She pulled the blanket up, her voice low and rough. It's just the wind. It's nothing." But I could see the doubt flicker in her eyes, the same doubt I felt gnawing at my chest. The next morning, Sarah suggested a hike on a trail near Shoshone Lake, hoping the fresh air and daylight might clear the heaviness between us. We took the path that snaked through dense forest, the canopy thick enough to filter the sunlight into eerie green shadows. Every step felt like we were walking deeper into something ancient and unknowable. Halfway through, the birds fell silent. The usual sounds of insects and rustling leaves ceased, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then came a faint crack, a twig snapping underfoot, but no one else was there. We froze. A cold sweat broke out on my skin despite the warmth. Sarah's hand tightened around mine, her grip trembling. "We need to turn back," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. As we retraced our steps, the path seemed unfamiliar, distorted. The trees leaned inward unnaturally, their branches clawing at the sky. The trail markers we passed on the way in were gone, or hidden beneath fresh dirt and leaves. I felt the forest closing in, pressing, suffocating. Then, without warning, a low guttural growl erupted somewhere in the shadows behind us. It wasn't quite animal and not quite human. It was a sound that froze blood and clawed at sanity. Sarah pulled me faster, eyes wide with terror. We ran, branches slapping our faces, roots trying to trip us, heartbeats pounding like drums of warning. When we burst out of the forest's edge, gasping and shaking, the sounds vanished into the thick silence. Back at the RV, the atmosphere had shifted again. The night was colder, the darkness heavier. The stars overhead blinked out one by one, swallowed by an unnatural shadow that seemed to drip down from the sky. The knocking started again, louder now, echoing through the metal shell of the trailer like a death sentence. I faced the door, flashlight trembling in my hand. "Who's there?" I called, voice cracking with a fear I couldn't contain. Only silence answered. That night, sleep refused to come. I stared into the blackness, the weight of the forest's gaze burning into me. I thought about the vanished camper, about Sarah's warning, that Yellowstone is alive and sometimes it's angry. The morning light didn't bring relief, only a deeper understanding of what we were up against. RV camping in Yellowstone isn't just about beautiful vistas or peaceful nights by a crackling fire. It's about respect. Respect for the unseen, the unspoken, the ancient forces that lurk just beneath the surface. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't the wild animals or the rugged terrain. It's what hides in the silence between the trees, in the cold touch of the wind, in the tapping that never stops. You learn to listen, to watch, to trust the instinct that tells you when it's time to leave. Because in places like Yellowstone, when the forest whispers, you better be ready to answer or be ready to disappear. That last night, I couldn't pretend anymore that it was just the wind or a restless animal. The knocking had turned into pounding, urgent, angry, like a warning I had ignored too long. My skin crawled with every thump echoing through the RV, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a cold certainty settled. This wasn't natural. Something had awakened. I stood at the door again, flashlight clenched tight, my breath shallow and fast. The darkness outside felt alive, swirling just beyond the beam like smoke twisting into shapes that defied reason. Then I saw it. Eyes. Not animal eyes, but too large and too dark to belong to anything I knew. They watched me from the tree line, unblinking and patient. I couldn't move. My legs were rooted to the spot, heart hammering, throat dry and raw. The air thickened, heavy with that sickening, rotten smell that made my stomach turn. It pressed against me like an invisible weight, trying to steal my breath. I thought of Sarah, alone inside the RV, and the helplessness clawed at me worse than the fear outside. I wanted to shout, to call her out, to tell her to run, but no sound came. My voice had vanished. Then the pounding stopped. Silence crashed down around me, so complete it screamed in my ears. And then a whisper. Soft, almost tender, threading through the stillness like a ghost's caress. The voice spoke a language older than the park itself, a chant of warning, sorrow, and fury all at once. I couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. Leave. Now. I turned, every instinct screaming to flee. I threw open the RV door and yanked Sarah awake, her eyes wide and terrified but trusting. We didn't speak. There was no time. We packed in silence, the forest's breath hot on our backs. The moment we started the engine, the knocking returned, this time on the roof of the RV, pounding with furious desperation as if the forest itself was trying to claw us back. We drove through the night, headlights cutting through the thick mist, the pounding fading behind us only when the trees finally gave way to open road. The silence that followed was no comfort. It was the echo of what we'd left behind, a warning seared into my bones. Days later, sitting far from Yellowstone, I realized what the forest had tried to teach me. RV camping in places like this isn't about conquering nature. It's about listening to it, respecting its mysteries, and knowing when the fear you feel isn't just in your head. It's a real, living thing, one that can save you if you heed it, or consume you if you don't. I learned to trust those whispers, to watch the shadows, to feel the cold breath of the unknown on my neck. Because sometimes the greatest survival skill isn't gear or maps. It's the courage to believe the forest is speaking and the wisdom to walk away when it's angry. That's the hidden danger of RV camping in Yellowstone. Not the bears, not the geysers, but the silence that hides 1,000 secrets, waiting for the next traveler brave enough or foolish enough to listen. And when you hear it, don't ignore the warning. Because out there, beneath the stars and towering pines, the forest remembers every step you take, and sometimes it never forgets. Before we dive into the next exciting story, drop a comment below and let me know, what time is it where you're watching from? I'm curious to see where everyone's tuning in from around the world. The road wound through the dense trees, snaking deeper into the heart of the Yellowstone National Forest. The thick canopy above allowed only sparse sunlight to filter through, casting shadows across the narrow dirt road. I gripped the steering wheel of my RV, trying to shake off the gnawing sense of unease creeping up my spine. It had been 3 hours since I'd passed another vehicle. Solitude was the whole point, wasn't it? This trip was supposed to help me clear my head, to reconnect with myself after the divorce. I had spent the last few months in a fog, and this trip to Deadwood Creek was meant to be my escape, a test of independence. No ex-husband, no stress, just me in the wilderness. I needed this. At least, that's what I've been telling myself for the past 2 weeks. Deadwood Creek Campground wasn't listed on any mainstream maps, just a blip on an obscure site for hardcore campers who sought isolation. The campground had a reputation, but that was part of the appeal. I needed remote quiet, far away from anything that reminded me of what I'd left behind. But as I pulled into the clearing, past the sign half buried in moss that read Deadwood Creek, a shiver ran through me. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you second-guess your decision to be alone. I parked the RV near a small trickling creek. The only other vehicle was an old, beat-up camper a short distance away. Nestled under the towering pines, it was empty. No sign of movement, no campfire. Good. I wasn't in the mood for socializing. I stepped out into the cool afternoon air and surveyed the site. The woods were thick, ancient. The ground was littered with pine needles, muffling the sound of my footsteps. A perfect retreat. I set up camp, unfolding my chair and setting my mug of tea beside me as I sat by the creek, listening to the soft gurgle of the water. It was peaceful, just as I'd hoped. But after a while, the peace felt off, too still. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me, and the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was oppressive. My mind wandered back to the stories I'd read online, the rumors about Deadwood Creek's dark history. This used to be a mining settlement during the gold rush, or so the tale went. Dozens of men had come to find their fortunes, but most found only death, mysterious disappearances, bodies never recovered. Some say the men still haunt the place, bound to the land, working their endless shifts beneath the earth. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to local folklore meant to spook tourists. But now, sitting alone in the fading light, the stories didn't seem so far-fetched. The wind rustled the trees, and I jumped at the sound. Get it together, Hannah, I thought, rolling my eyes at my own nerves. I hadn't come all this way just to scare myself into leaving. That's when I saw him, a man standing near the edge of the campground, just at the tree line, leaning against a tree. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a scruffy beard, his clothes worn and dirty, as if he'd been out here for weeks. His gaze was fixed on me. I waved awkwardly, and he lifted a hand in response before slowly walking over. "Didn't mean to spook you," he said, his voice easy, almost too casual. "Didn't expect anyone else out here this late in the season." "I wasn't expecting anyone either," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just needed some time alone, you know." "Yeah, I get that," he chuckled, though the sound didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm Rick, by the way. Been coming here for years." I nodded, unsure what to say. Rick had the look of someone who belonged out here, who knew the woods like the back of his hand. I didn't. "Be careful out here," Rick said after a pause, his gaze drifting toward the woods. "Deadwood Creek's got a history. Strange things happen when the sun goes down." My skin prickled at his words, but I forced myself to laugh. "Let me guess. Ghost stories? Miners and all that?" Rick's expression didn't change. Something like that. Just don't stray too far from your camp. He turned and walked back to his camper without another word, leaving me with a knot of unease in my stomach. That night, I couldn't sleep. The RV was quiet, the temperature inside dropping faster than I expected. I wrapped myself in blankets and tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Then the sound started. At first, I thought it was the wind, but soon I realized it was more than that. Faint at first, barely perceptible. A rhythmic clinking echoed from the direction of the creek. It sounded like tools. Mining tools, pickaxes striking rock. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding. No, I was just imagining it. This was what I came here for. Solitude. But I couldn't shake the sound. It was getting louder, the metallic rhythm persistent, almost like a heartbeat. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed out of the RV, my breath visible in the cold night air. The forest was a wall of darkness, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. The sound of the creek was louder now, rushing over rocks, and I could swear I heard voices, whispers carried on the wind. My flashlight beam swept across the campsite, catching nothing but trees and the faint shimmer of water. But then I saw them. Figures, shadowy half-formed shapes moving by the creek, their outlines faint but unmistakably human. They moved like they were working, digging, swinging pickaxes in time with the clinking sound. My throat tightened as I realized they weren't there in the normal sense. They were translucent, faded. I stumbled back, my mind scrambling to make sense of it. Ghosts? No, that was impossible. I backed toward the RV, my pulse racing, but as I turned, I nearly collided with Rick. "Easy," he said, raising his hands. "I saw your light. Thought I'd come check on you." I couldn't find the words to explain what I'd just seen, but Rick didn't need me to. He just looked over at the creek and nodded, his face unreadable. "They come out at night. The miners, been here for over a century, trapped in their own hell." I swallowed hard, trying to suppress the rising panic. "You mean you know about this? What is this place?" Rick gave a half smile, though it was more sad than comforting. "Deadwood Creek. These men came here to find gold, but all they found was death. Now they're stuck here, working the land forever. Some nights they're just echoes. Other nights..." He trailed off, but the implication was clear. On other nights, they weren't just echoes. My name is Orion Scott, and in 2020, I took my RV out to the remote stretches of the Yukon Territory in Canada. Being cooped up in an office for years had me yearning for some real adventure and fresh air. I figured a solo trip into the wilderness would be just the ticket to reset my mind. I had always been an outdoor enthusiast, but life's responsibilities kept pushing my plans further down the line. Finally, I decided enough was enough. I packed up my gear, loaded the RV, and set off for Yellowstone National Park. The idea of vast landscapes and untouched nature was too alluring to resist. The drive up was uneventful, filled with the usual mix of truckers and fellow travelers. I made a stop in a small town called Haines Junction to stock up on supplies. The locals were friendly, but gave me that look. You know, the one that says, "You're not from around here, are you?" One old-timer at the general store chuckled when I told him where I was headed. "Watch out for the gold," he said with a grin. "Gold?" I replied, raising an eyebrow. "Folks around here get crazy when it comes to gold," he added before shuffling away. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just local humor that went over my city slicker head. With my RV loaded, I continued toward the park. The scenery became more breathtaking with each mile, the kind of beauty that makes you forget about emails and deadlines. I found a secluded spot near a crystal-clear lake, surrounded by towering mountains. Setting up camp, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I spent the day hiking and snapping photos, marveling at how untouched everything felt. That evening, I built a small fire and settled in with a book. The silence was profound, only broken by the occasional rustling of leaves or distant animal calls. As night fell, the temperature dropped significantly. I retreated into the RV, thankful for the small heater I had installed. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard a faint noise outside, like metal clinking. Probably just settling sounds, I told myself, but then it happened again, louder this time. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The cold air hit me instantly, my breath forming small clouds. Scanning the area, I saw nothing unusual. The RV stood alone under the starlit sky, and the forest edge was shrouded in darkness. "Must be hearing things," I muttered, turning to go back inside. That's when I noticed footprints near the back of the RV, fresh ones that weren't mine. They led toward the woods and disappeared among the trees. A chill ran down my spine, and not just from the cold. I decided it was best to lock up and stay inside for the night. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the windows, and the uneasy feeling from the night before seemed almost silly. I convinced myself it was probably a hunter or another camper passing by. After breakfast, I decided to explore a nearby trail that promised stunning views. About an hour into the hike, I stumbled upon something that made me stop in my tracks. A rusty pickaxe leaning against a tree with a worn leather bag beside it. Curiosity piqued, I approached and nudged the bag with my foot. Out spilled a collection of old mining tools and a small glass vial filled with gold flakes. "Well, would you look at that?" I said aloud. Maybe the old-timer wasn't joking after all. I considered taking the vial, but thought better of it. The last thing I needed was to get involved in someone else's business. As I continued along the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle, but whenever I turned around, nothing was there. Deciding I'd had enough hiking for one day, I headed back to camp. As I approached, I noticed smoke rising in the distance, not from my sight, but somewhere nearby. It seemed odd given how isolated this place was. Back at the RV, I made a sandwich and tried to relax, but an uneasiness settled in. To distract myself, I pulled out my fishing gear and walked down to the lake. The water was so clear you could see the fish swimming near the surface. I cast my line and waited. "Not biting today, huh?" I said after an hour with no luck. Just then, a voice behind me replied, "Fish around here don't care much for strangers." I nearly jumped out of my skin. Spinning around, I saw a man standing a few feet away. He was rugged looking, with a thick beard and clothes that had seen better days. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said with a crooked smile. "No worries," I replied, trying to steady my voice. "Didn't hear you coming." "I'm used to moving quietly," he said, stepping closer. "Name's Silas." "Kevin," I offered, extending a hand. He looked at it for a moment before shaking it firmly. "What brings you out to these parts?" he asked. "Just taking some time off work, enjoying nature," I said. He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning me up and down. "Not many folks come out here alone. I like the solitude," I replied, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. "Solitude's a funny thing," he mused. "Can make a man see and do strange things." "Well, I should probably get back," I said, reeling in my line. "Sure thing. Be seeing you around," he said, that crooked smile returning. I hurried back to the RV, glancing over my shoulder to make sure he wasn't following me. Something about Silas didn't sit right. Maybe it was the way he appeared out of nowhere or how he seemed to savor each word he spoke. That evening, I decided to keep a low profile. I locked all the doors and windows, drew the shades, and kept the lights dimmed. As the hours passed, I started to feel a bit silly. Maybe I was overreacting. Around midnight, just as I was about to call it a night, I heard footsteps circling the RV. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for the closest thing resembling a weapon, a cast iron skillet. The footsteps stopped near the door. There was a scratching sound, followed by a low chuckle. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. Silence. Then a whispered reply. "Just enjoying the night air." It was Silas. "What do you want?" I demanded. "Thought you might like some company. I'm fine on my own, thanks." "Funny thing about being alone," he continued, "you never know what's lurking around." "Leave me alone," I shouted. The doorknob rattled as he tried to open it. Now that's not very hospitable. A loud thud came from the roof, followed by the sound of footsteps overhead. My eyes darted upward. How many of them were there? Desperate, I dashed to the driver's seat, tossing the skillet aside. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Without wasting a second, I slammed it into gear and hit the gas. In the rearview mirror, I saw Silas stumbling to his feet, a look of rage contorting his face. Then, headlights appeared behind me. 2 motorcycles, gaining fast. Panic surged anew. "Seriously? What is this, a horror movie?" I muttered. Trying to inject some humor into a dire situation, I floored the accelerator, but the RV wasn't built for speed. The motorcycles closed the gap quickly. One pulled up alongside me, and I caught a glimpse of the rider, Another rugged-looking man, his face partially covered by a bandana. He swung something heavy against the side window, a metal chain. The glass cracked but didn't shatter. "Not today!" I shouted, swerving the RV toward him. He veered off, losing control and skidding into the brush. The second rider was more persistent. He pulled ahead and tried to block the road. I had no choice. Clenching my jaw, I gripped the wheel and rammed the RV into his bike. He tumbled away as I sped past. Heart pounding, I kept driving until the sun began to rise. I reached a larger town and pulled into a gas station. Shaking from the ordeal, I stumbled inside and told the clerk to call the police. Within minutes, officers arrived. I recounted everything: the encounters with Silas, the attack, the chase. They exchanged glances. "You're not the first to report something like this," one officer said grimly. "Excuse me?" "There's a group operating in these parts," he continued. "Illegal miners protecting their claims. They've been known to intimidate or worse." "Illegal miners? Like gold miners?" I asked, recalling the old-timer's warning. "Exactly. They don't take kindly to outsiders stumbling upon their operations," he said. They took my statement and assured me they'd investigate. Exhausted, I decided to find a motel and get some rest. Later that day, curiosity got the better of me. Using my laptop, I dug into local news and forums. Stories surfaced about missing hikers, unexplained disappearances, and rumors of a shadowy group guarding hidden mines. One article mentioned a man named Silas Harper, a former geologist turned illegal miner, suspected in multiple disappearances but never charged due to lack of evidence. "Great, I had a run-in with a psycho prospector," I muttered. I informed the police about what I found, hoping it would help their investigation. A few days later, I prepared to head home. As I was fueling up, I overheard two men talking. "Another camper went missing up near Cluane," one said. "Must have crossed paths with Silas and his crew," the other replied. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't over for others out there. Driving away, I couldn't shake the thought of those still venturing into the wilderness, unaware of the dangers lurking. Not from nature, but from those guarding their secrets with deadly resolve. Silas Harper, a man driven by greed, willing to do anything to protect his hidden gold mines, no matter the cost. I was halfway up Blackwater Ridge when Glenn warned me about the lights. His bait shop was the last stop before the mountain trail turned into pure wilderness, and I dropped in for some extra firewood. He was standing behind the counter, leaning on his elbows, watching me load up my supplies. His words hung in the air long after they left his mouth. "People get lost up there," he said, his voice low and cautious. "You hear the stories?" I zipped up my jacket and shook my head. "What stories?" "About the lights. They show up when the sun goes down, start flickering in the trees like they're leading you somewhere, but you follow them, you don't come back." I should have known better than to brush him off. I should have asked more questions. But the truth was, I didn't care. I wasn't here for ghost stories or local superstitions. I was here to clear my head after everything that had happened with Ryan. The breakup, the endless nights of replaying every argument in my head. I needed this time away from the world. Just me and my RV parked in the middle of nowhere. Blackwater Ridge had seemed perfect, a remote place where no one could find me, and more importantly, where I wouldn't be tempted to find anyone. "I'll be fine," I told Glenn, trying to smile, but his eyes were serious, unblinking. "Just watch yourself," he said, handing me a small pouch as I paid for the wood. "Keep this with you. Some folks say it helps." "What is it?" "Just something my family's passed down," he said, avoiding my gaze. "Might keep the lights away." I didn't believe in that kind of thing, but I pocketed the pouch anyway, more out of politeness than anything else. Then I left the shop, got into my RV, and made my way up the winding mountain road toward Blackwater Ridge. The campsite was exactly what I'd hoped for: deserted, overgrown, and tucked away in a grove of tall pines. The air smelled crisp and clean, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The old campground looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There were a few rusted RVs half hidden in the foliage, relics of past campers who'd either left them behind or forgotten about them altogether. I parked my RV at the far edge of the grove, close enough to the trees to feel enclosed, but far enough from the abandoned vehicles to avoid any weird vibes. It was perfect, a place to disconnect and forget. That first day was peaceful. I went for a hike, snapped a few photos, and by the time the sun was setting, I was sitting outside by the fire pit, listening to the crackling flames and sipping from a thermos of tea. The sky was clear, and the stars began to poke through the darkness, dotting the sky like tiny pinpricks of light. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A small flickering light deep in the woods, just past the tree line. At first, I thought it was a firefly, but it was too big. It moved slowly, gliding through the trees like it was looking for something, or someone. I sat up, narrowing my eyes to focus. The light was faint, but unmistakable. It pulsed gently, like a heartbeat, its glow barely reaching me through the dense pines. Then another light appeared beside it, then another. 3 faint orbs flickering in unison, moving deeper into the forest. Glenn's warning about the lights echoed in my mind, but I shook it off. They were probably just campers in the distance, or maybe a reflection from a house far off the ridge. I wasn't about to let some old superstition spook me on my first night. I sat back, trying to relax, but the lights wouldn't leave me alone. They moved again, gliding slowly through the trees as if they were beckoning me to follow. I could almost hear a whisper in the air, like soft voices drifting on the wind. "Come closer." I stood abruptly, shaking my head. "No," I muttered to myself. "You're not doing this. You came here to get away, not chase after stupid lights in the woods." But the longer I stood there, the harder it was to ignore them. They were so gentle, so inviting. It felt like they were calling me, pulling at some part of me that I couldn't explain. My feet shifted forward, inching toward the forest edge. "Come." I blinked, snapping out of it. What was I doing? I wasn't about to follow some strange lights into the woods. Glenn had warned me, hadn't he? I couldn't let myself get sucked into this nonsense. I backed away from the trees, heart pounding, and went back into my RV, slamming the door behind me. The lights flickered one last time outside the window before they disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent the morning hiking, trying to focus on anything but what had happened the night before. But the woods felt different now, quieter. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves had faded, replaced by a stillness that pressed in on me. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I thought I saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees or the faintest flicker of light just out of sight. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was letting Glenn's warning get under my skin. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. By the time evening came, the anxiety had settled into my bones. I lit another fire and sat outside staring into the flames, trying to calm myself. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the lights came back. This time, they were closer. I watched, frozen, as they flickered between the trees, more of them now. 5, maybe 6, all moving in the same slow, rhythmic pattern. They circled the edge of the campground, their glow soft but persistent. I felt that same pull again, stronger this time, like invisible hands reaching out to me. "Come." The whispers were clearer now, louder. They filled my ears, my mind, drowning out everything else. It sounded like his voice, Ryan, his soft, pleading tone asking me to come closer, to follow. I stood, my body moving of its own accord. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was need. I needed to know what these lights were, where they were leading me. Maybe it was Ryan. Maybe he'd followed me, wanted to make things right. The thought was irrational, but in that moment, it made perfect sense. I took a step toward the forest, then another. My heart raced as I approached the tree line, the lights growing brighter, more vivid. But as I crossed into the shadows, something shifted in the air. The forest felt wrong, twisted, like the trees were closing in around me. The lights flickered erratically, their gentle glow turning sharp, jagged. I froze. The whispers turned darker, harsher. "Come now." No, this wasn't right. This wasn't Ryan. This was something else. Something wrong. I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. The lights surged forward, surrounding me, blinding me. In desperation, I grabbed the pouch Glenn had given me, clutching it tightly. The lights flickered wildly, then dimmed. I backed away as the whispers receded, and the lights finally disappeared, leaving me alone in the dark woods, shaking. My name's Maddox Stevens, and back in 1997, I took my old RV to the fringes of the Ozark National Forest. I was tired of the desk job grind in Kansas City, so I thought a solo camping trip might clear my head. The plan was simple: drive out, park by the creek, spend a couple of days fishing, grilling, and enjoying the quiet. No neighbors, no boss breathing down my neck, just peace. Now, if you've never been to the Ozarks, picture this: dense trees that go on forever, steep hills that make you feel tiny, and a silence so thick you start hearing things that aren't there. I parked close to the Mulberry River, deep enough into the forest that I wouldn't see another soul unless they were as lost as I felt. The first day was as peaceful as I'd hoped. I set up my fold-out chair by the water, cracked open a cheap beer, and tossed in a line. Nothing but me, the fish, and an occasional hawk gliding above. I slept like a rock that night, only to wake up to a strange sound echoing through the trees. At first, I brushed it off. It could have been a coyote, maybe a raccoon rooting around my camp. But when I got out of the RV, I saw footprints around the site. Not paw prints. Footprints. Human. And too close to my RV for comfort. I laughed it off, figured maybe some other camper got lost and wandered through, though I hadn't seen anyone else. The next day was fine, but around dusk, I got the uneasy feeling that I was being watched. Now, I'm not the kind of guy who spooks easily. I spent my teenage years in the woods hunting deer and fishing with my dad, and I thought I knew these forests well enough. But there was something different this time. You could say the silence felt heavier, as if the trees were listening. Later that night, I heard it again, rustling near the RV. I got up, flashlight in hand, and took a quick look around. Nothing. Just shadows and my own nervous imagination, I told myself. But the next morning, the footprints were back. Closer this time, with the ground scuffed up like someone had been dragging something. I didn't see anyone, but as I scanned the trees, I caught a flash of movement, a shape quickly slipping behind a tree about 50 yards out. Now, I know what you're thinking: could have been a deer or some other animal, but there was something too deliberate about it. I didn't get a clear look, but I knew I'd seen someone. By this point, I wasn't about to leave. Call it stubborn pride. I'd come here to escape the grind, not to get spooked by some weirdo lurking in the woods. I kept my pocket knife on me and decided I'd keep watch that night, just to settle my nerves. That evening, around midnight, I heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps. Someone was walking through the underbrush, deliberately slow, like they were trying to make as little noise as possible. I turned off the RV lights and waited, crouched near the door, hoping whoever it was would just walk on by. Then I heard the sound of metal clinking. It was faint, but it had that rhythmic quality, like someone was checking their gear. I'll admit, my heart was racing at this point. I've had my fair share of bar fights and tussles over the years, but nothing prepared me for the feeling of being hunted. I spent the rest of the night on edge, gripping that pocket knife so tight my hand cramped. Around 4 a.m., I heard the footsteps fade away. Whoever it was had either lost interest or decided to let me stew in my own fear. By dawn, I was dead tired, but I wasn't about to stay in that RV another night. As I packed up, I noticed something horrifying: a small, bloodied cloth hanging on the rear bumper of my RV, as if someone had left me a warning. The footprints were everywhere now, deep and deliberate, as though the person had been circling the RV, studying it. I grabbed my stuff and decided to make for the ranger station about 10 miles down the road. But as I turned onto the path, there he was, standing dead center in my way. He was tall, with wiry arms and a weathered face that looked like it hadn't seen a smile in decades. In his hands, he held an old, rusty axe that looked like it had been used on more than just trees. Without a word, he started toward me, swinging that axe back and forth in a slow, almost taunting rhythm. I yelled at him to back off, trying to sound braver than I felt, but he just kept coming, his face blank, like he wasn't even seeing me. I don't know what possessed me, but I bolted back to the RV, slamming the door shut and locking it, as if that flimsy door would keep him out. He started hammering on the side of the RV, each hit sending shudders through the frame. I managed to grab a signal on my cell, just long enough to call for help, but all they could make out was the frantic tone in my voice before the line cut out. The banging stopped. I thought maybe he'd given up. But when I peered out the window, I saw him crouched by the creek, washing something in the water. The sun was coming up, casting an eerie light over the forest, and I could finally see what he'd been carrying. A blood-stained shirt. That shirt looked familiar, and my stomach dropped when I recognized it as belonging to one of the hikers I had seen posted as missing at the ranger station. He stood up, holding that shirt like a trophy, and gave me a look that told me he knew exactly what he was doing, terrorizing me, making sure I understood that he was in control. I knew I couldn't stay there. I turned on the RV, flooring it down the narrow forest road, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. I got to the ranger station, my knuckles white from gripping the wheel. I blurted out the story, barely making sense, and they called the local sheriff. I told them about the man, the axe, and the bloody shirt. They took me seriously, but there was this look in their eyes, like they'd seen this before. One of the rangers pulled me aside and said, "You're not the first to run into him. We call him Old Todd. Used to work in these parts years back. They say he snapped after losing his family, started blaming hikers for bringing bad luck." I was too shaken to ask questions. The sheriff led a search party back to my campsite, but by the time they arrived, the site was empty. Just a few bloodstains by the creek and the impression of heavy boots in the mud. They found the shirt I'd seen him washing, tied to a tree, as if it were some twisted kind of offering. The sheriff shook his head, muttering something about how Old Todd was like a ghost. He'd appear just long enough to scare the life out of folks before vanishing into the trees. They said he'd lived out there so long, he knew the land better than any of them, slipping away whenever they got too close. They asked if I wanted to press charges, but what good would that do? You can't jail a man you can't catch. My name is Landon Fisher, I'm 23 years old, and this happened just last fall in the wilderness of Spruce Knob, West Virginia. I was there. I was there with my brother Mark, his girlfriend Emily, and his best friend Ryan. We had planned a week-long camping trip, what was supposed to be a much-needed break from the grind of everyday life. Instead, it became a nightmare I can barely talk about, even now. It started as a simple idea. Mark, 28, was always the adventurous one, the kind of guy who thought following a marked trail was too easy. I went along because I needed to document local flora and fauna for my thesis in biology. Emily, 27, tagged along to spend more time with Mark and indulge her love of spooky campfire stories. Then there was Ryan, 26, clumsy and lovable, eager to make memories away from his desk job. Together, we made an odd group, but we figured we'd have fun. We parked the RV at the Whispering Pines trailhead and set off into the dense, ancient forest. The air smelled of moss and pine, and sunlight dappled the ground through the canopy. Spruce Knob, the highest peak in West Virginia, loomed in the distance. Mark insisted we take an unmarked route he'd found on an old map, and despite my reservations, we followed him deeper into the woods. The first 2 days were relatively uneventful, apart from Ryan's usual mishaps. He forgot a tent pole, forcing us to patch his tent with duct tape. One of our flashlights died inexplicably, even though we had checked all the batteries beforehand. Small annoyances, but nothing we couldn't handle. It was the second night when things began to feel off. We had set up camp near a clearing surrounded by spruce trees. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced on the surrounding trunks. Emily had just finished telling a story about the children of the forest, ghostly figures said to lure hikers to their deaths. Mark groaned and threw a pine cone at her. "Enough of that nonsense," he said. "You're gonna scare Ryan." Ryan, to his credit, laughed nervously but didn't respond. That's when I noticed the quiet. The usual nighttime symphony of crickets and distant owls had stopped completely. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Mark smirked. "I don't hear anything. That's the point. Peace and quiet, Jess." "No," Emily said, her voice tight. "She's right. It's too quiet." Mark rolled his eyes and poked the fire. "You two are just looking for something to be scared about." I decided to let it go, but a gnawing unease crept into my chest. That night, I woke up to what sounded like footsteps circling the tents. They were deliberate, crunching softly on the forest floor. I held my breath, listening, my heart pounding. "Landon," a voice whispered. It sounded like Mark. I unzipped my tent slowly, peeking out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow. Just beyond the light, I saw Mark's silhouette standing by the trees. "What are you doing?" I hissed. He didn't respond. "Mark?" The figure turned and walked into the woods. My first thought was that he was sleepwalking. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out and followed. But when I reached the spot where I'd seen him, he was gone. There were no footprints in the dirt. When I got back to the tents, Mark was snoring loudly inside his. The next morning, I told the group what I'd seen. Mark laughed it off. "You were dreaming," he said. "Too many ghost stories from Emily." "I wasn't dreaming," I snapped. "I know what I saw." Ryan looked uneasy but didn't say anything. Emily just stared at the ground. We packed up and continued hiking, but the atmosphere had changed. Mark's confidence began to grate on me. Emily kept glancing over her shoulder and Ryan's usual jokes dried up. Around midday, we stumbled upon something strange, a set of tracks in the dirt. They looked human but larger, with elongated toes and claw marks at the tips. "What kind of animal leaves tracks like that?" I asked. Mark crouched down, frowning. "Probably a bear with a weird gait." "Bears don't have claws like that," Emily said, her voice trembling. Mark shrugged. "Then maybe Bigfoot. Relax." But I couldn't relax. The tracks led straight toward our intended campsite. That night was worse. We built a larger fire and sat close to it, as though the flames could ward off whatever was out there. Mark and Emily argued about whether we should turn back. Ryan stayed quiet, staring into the fire like it held answers. Then the laughter started. It was faint at first, like children playing hide-and-seek in the distance. But it grew louder, circling our camp. "Who's there?" Mark shouted, grabbing his flashlight. The beam flickered and went out. He smacked it against his palm, but it stayed dead. "Landon," the voice was back, soft and lilting, but this time it wasn't alone. It was joined by Emily's voice, then Ryan's, all of them calling my name. "Stay by the fire," Emily whispered, clutching my arm. "Don't leave the firelight." Mark ignored her and stepped into the darkness. "Mark, no!" I shouted. He disappeared into the trees. We waited, calling for him, but he didn't answer. Then we saw him stumble back into the light. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "It's not human," he said, his voice shaking. Before we could ask what he meant, the creature emerged. It stood just beyond the firelight, its form shifting and flickering like a mirage. One moment, it looked like Mark, then Emily, then me. Its face stretched into an unnatural grin, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on us. Emily screamed. Ryan fell backward, scrambling away from the fire. "Salt!" Emily shouted suddenly. "We need salt!" I remembered the packets we'd brought for meals. I grabbed them from my bag, ripping them open and tossing the contents around the fire. The creature hissed and recoiled, its form blurring before it vanished into the shadows. We didn't sleep that night. Mark finally admitted we needed to leave. But when we reached the RV the next morning, we found the tires slashed, claw marks gouged into the doors. "It doesn't want us to leave," Emily said, her voice hollow. "Then we walk," I said. "We'll head to the ranger station." The hike was grueling. Every sound in the forest set us on edge, and the feeling of being watched never left. By midday, the creature returned. It didn't attack but followed us, always just out of sight. Sometimes it looked like Emily, sometimes like Mark, sometimes like something entirely inhuman. When we reached a narrow trail along a cliffside, it attacked. The creature lunged at Mark, who fought it off with a burning stick from our campfire. "Go!" he shouted. "Get to the station!" "Mark, no!" I screamed, but he wouldn't listen. He stood his ground, the flames casting his shadow long against the rocks. We ran. We reached the ranger station at dawn, our legs shaking, lungs burning. The creature didn't follow us into the sunlight, but Mark was gone. Even now, I dream of him standing at the edge of the woods, his eyes glowing yellow. He whispers, "Come back. I never will." I always hated feeling tethered to anything, so when the relationship ended, I knew I had to get away. No more distractions, no more emotional baggage, I just needed a break. Crater Lake seemed perfect, beautiful, isolated, and most importantly, quiet. I packed my old RV, grabbed some hiking gear, and headed out for a long weekend of camping. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already beginning to set behind the towering cliffs surrounding the lake. Crater Lake was as stunning as I'd imagined. Deep blue waters so clear they reflected the sky, encircled by jagged cliffs that loomed like ancient sentinels. The park was busy enough near the main viewpoints, but I was smart. I'd found a campsite far from the crowds, tucked away near the southeastern shore where the trees were thick and the lake was quieter, almost unnervingly so. It was just what I wanted, solitude. But as I parked my RV and set up camp, a strange feeling settled over me. The wind was too still, and even though the lake was calm, there was a low hum in the air, like the whisper of something just out of earshot. I shook it off. Just nerves, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. After all, I hadn't done a solo trip like this since before I met Sarah. The memories tugged at me, but I pushed them away. I spent the first evening by the fire, watching the stars come out as the lake turned to ink. Crater Lake was famous for its clarity, its mirror-like surface reflecting everything above it perfectly. But tonight, the water looked different, darker, maybe even opaque. I stared out across the lake, trying to ignore the strange tightness in my chest when I heard it. A faint sound carried on the wind. Laughter, childlike, distant, but unmistakable. I sat up, listening harder. The night was still, but there it was again, faint but clear. I scanned the shoreline, looking for anyone else camping nearby. Nothing but fog creeping over the water and the flickering shadows of my fire. Probably kids playing somewhere across the lake, I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. I was too far out. The ranger had said as much when I checked in. This spot was about as secluded as you could get. Besides, the laughter didn't sound right. It was high-pitched, but it echoed strangely, like it was bouncing off the cliffs and the water at the same time. Shaking my head, I stood and stoked the fire, trying to lose myself in the warmth. The sound died away after a few minutes, and eventually I convinced myself it was nothing, just the wind or maybe my tired mind playing tricks on me. It had been a long drive, after all. I crawled into the RV that night, settling in for what I hoped would be a peaceful sleep, but the unease stayed with me, clinging to my mind like the fog that now blanketed the campsite. I dreamt of the lake, shapes moving beneath the surface, dark and indistinct, like hands reaching up from the depths. The next day was better. I hiked along the rim of the lake, took in the views, and even managed to shake off some of the weird vibes from the night before. The sunlight was bright and reassuring, cutting through the mist, and the water looked clearer now, less murky. I convinced myself I'd just been tired. That's all it had been. By afternoon, I decided to take the kayak out. The water was calm, almost unnaturally so. The kayak sliced through the surface effortlessly, and for a while, I let myself enjoy it. The silence of the lake was peaceful, broken only by the soft splash of my paddle. Then the ripples started. At first, they were small, nothing more than the gentle rocking of water disturbed by a fish, maybe. But as I moved farther out, the ripples became more pronounced. They seemed to come from nowhere, disturbing the otherwise glassy surface of the lake. I stopped paddling, staring at the water, trying to figure out where they were coming from. There was nothing, no fish, no breeze, no sign of anything that could cause the water to move like that. But the ripples were there, spreading out from somewhere beneath the kayak. That's when I saw it. A dark shape, maybe 15 feet below, moving slowly. It was too large to be a fish and too humanoid to be anything I could easily explain. It floated there for a moment before drifting deeper, vanishing into the darkness. I blinked, gripping my paddle tighter. My heart raced, but I forced myself to breathe. Maybe it was a log, I reasoned, or some weird optical illusion. I was looking through layers of water after all, and who knew how light refracted down there? But deep down, I didn't believe it. I paddled back to shore faster than I cared to admit, my eyes glued to the water the whole time, watching for any more signs of movement. By the time I made it back to my campsite, the sun was starting to dip, and the fog was rolling in again, thicker this time. The wind picked up just enough to rustle the trees, and with it came that faint sound again, laughter. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I stood at the edge of the lake, staring out into the mist, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It was definitely children's voices now, several of them giggling and splashing. But as I scanned the shoreline, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. There was no one there, no boats, no campers, just the fog hanging low over the water like a shroud. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I should have packed up right then, driven away, and never looked back. But I stayed. Stupid. I know. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Crater Lake had its fair share of myths and legends, but I didn't believe in that stuff. I'd never been the superstitious type. Then I saw them, just shadows at first, small figures standing at the water's edge, half obscured by the fog. They didn't move, just stood there, watching. They were small, like children, but their outlines were blurred, indistinct. I blinked, trying to focus, and in that split second, they were gone. I stepped back from the shore, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't seeing things. They were there. I'd seen them. A cold chill washed over me as the wind died, leaving the air deathly still. The whispers started again, faint and melodic, drifting across the water. But this time, they were louder, closer. I backed toward the RV, glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those figures standing behind me. Nothing. I fumbled with the RV door, slamming it shut behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. I sat there in the dim light, listening. The whispers grew louder, like they were pressing in on me from all sides. It was as if the voices were coming from the lake itself, echoing relentlessly. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but it didn't stop. The sounds seeped into my mind, becoming clearer, more distinct. I could hear the splashing of water and the soft giggles turning into cries. It was children drowning, calling for help. I could hear their little hands slapping against the surface of the water, their desperate gasps for air. My breath hitched, panic rising in my chest. I had to get out of here. I threw my gear into the RV, not caring about the mess, as I reached for the ignition. The RV's lights flickered and died. The engine wouldn't turn over. I cursed under my breath, frantically trying the key again and again. Nothing. Outside, the whispers grew louder. I could hear the faint tapping now, soft knocks against the RV windows. My blood ran cold as I turned. Handprints, small, wet handprints, appeared on the windows, slowly sliding down the glass. The whispers turned into cries. The tapping grew more frantic, louder, as if they were trying to get in, trying to pull me out to the water. I backed away, my mind spinning, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. The air inside the RV felt suffocating, thick with dread. Then I heard it, splashing, close, right outside, like something was struggling in the water. Without thinking, I rushed to the door, flinging it open. The fog was so thick now I could barely see a few feet in front of me, but I could hear the splashing, the cries for help, the child's voice desperate, calling for me. Help me, please. My legs carried me toward the lake before my brain could catch up. The water lapped softly at the shore. The cries were louder, more desperate. I could see something out there, flailing in the shallows. A small figure, arms reaching up, struggling against the current. I was almost at the water's edge when the fog shifted just enough for me to see it clearly. The child was translucent, its skin pale and waterlogged. Its eyes were wide, empty sockets. Its mouth was open in a silent scream as it reached for me. Wet, skeletal hands clawed at the water, pulling it closer to me. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The figure stopped struggling, its head tilting to one side as if studying me. Then it smiled, a cold, unnatural smile that chilled me to my core. I ran, my feet pounding the earth as I raced back to the RV. The laughter faded into the distance, echoing through the fog. I slammed the door behind me, locking it again, like collapsing to the floor, gasping for air. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The whispers, the laughter, the tapping on the windows, they didn't stop until dawn. When the sun finally broke through the fog, I packed up and drove away without looking back. I didn't care that the RV was barely running or that I left half my gear behind. I just needed to get away from that lake. But even now, as I sit in the safety of my apartment, I can still hear them sometimes. The faint whispers, the splashing of water, the laughter. Crater Lake isn't as quiet as it seems, and I know they're still there waiting. My name is Luke Walker, and back in 2019, I took my RV up to Wrangell St. Elias National Park in Alaska. I figured a solo trip into the wild would be the perfect antidote to my cubicle-induced claustrophobia. Plus, after burning yet another batch of spaghetti at home, I thought maybe the wilderness would help me find my inner Bear Grylls, or at least teach me how not to set off the smoke alarm. I arrived at the park on a crisp August morning. The air was so fresh it felt like nature's version of a deep breath. I parked my RV in a secluded spot near a glacial stream, thinking I'd found my own little slice of paradise. The only neighbors I had were towering pines and the occasional moose, who looked at me like I was the intruder, which, to be fair, I was. After setting up camp, I decided to explore the surroundings, armed with a map, a compass I pretended to know how to use, and a trail mix that was 90% chocolate. I ventured into the forest. The serenity was overwhelming. For once, the only notifications I heard were birds chirping and leaves rustling. It was a far cry from the constant ping of emails back home. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled upon a small, weathered cabin nestled between the trees. It looked abandoned, with ivy crawling up the sides and windows clouded by dust. Curiosity got the better of me. I thought, why not take a peek? After all, what's the worst that could happen? Famous last words, I know. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, revealing a single-room interior cluttered with old furniture and hunting gear. Animal traps, fishing rods, and a wall adorned with antlers suggested that whoever lived here was serious about off-the-grid living, or just had a very specific decorating style. On a dusty table lay a journal. The pages were filled with scribbled notes and sketches of the surrounding area. One entry caught my eye. August 12th, spotted another hiker today. Must be cautious. Can't let anyone find out. That was yesterday's date. A chill settled in my gut. Maybe the cabin wasn't as abandoned as it seemed. I decided it was best to head back to my RV. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, and I didn't want to navigate the forest in the dark. As I retraced my steps, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. Every snapped twig and rustling leaf set my nerves on edge. I told myself I was being paranoid, perhaps a side effect of too many late-night horror movies and bad campfire stories. Back at the campsite, I cooked dinner over the fire, a culinary masterpiece of canned beans and slightly burnt sausages. Gordon Ramsay would have a field day critiquing my cooking skills. It's so raw it might just get up and walk away. I imagined him shouting. I chuckled into the night, the sound echoing among the trees. To lighten the mood further, I started telling jokes to myself. Why don't scientists trust atoms? Because they make up everything. I laughed, appreciating my own terrible sense of humor. It was just me and the wilderness, and I was determined to enjoy every minute. Just as I was considering turning in for the night, I heard a noise. A faint rustling coming from the edge of the clearing. Probably just an animal, but I thought. Alaska is full of wildlife. Then I heard it again, louder this time, accompanied by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. Human footsteps. Who's there? I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Silence. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the tree line. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow dart between the trees. My heart began to race. Maybe it was another camper, or perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me. Deciding that sitting outside made me feel too exposed, I retreated into the RV and locked the door. I felt a bit silly for being spooked, but better safe than sorry. I settled into bed, convincing myself that a good night's sleep would put everything into perspective. I woke abruptly to a loud thud against the side of the RV. My pulse quickened. That was no falling branch. I listened intently, straining to hear any other sounds. Then came another thud, harder this time, causing the RV to sway slightly. I quietly got out of bed and reached for the small kitchen knife I'd used earlier. Not exactly a weapon of choice, but better than nothing. I crept toward the window and peeked out, but the darkness revealed nothing. Suddenly, the RV's door handle jiggled. Someone was trying to get in. Panic surged through me. "Hey, who's out there?" I shouted, hoping to deter whoever it was. The jiggling stopped momentarily, only to resume more aggressively. I had to think fast. My phone had no signal, so calling for help was out of the question. Then I remembered the flare gun stowed away in a cabinet, a safety precaution I never thought I'd need. I grabbed it and positioned myself facing the door. "Leave now, or I'll shoot," I warned. The handle stopped moving. Silence enveloped the RV. Just when I thought it might be over, a heavy object slammed against the door, cracking the frame. I fired the flare gun at the door. The bright light illuminated the interior in a flash of red. The impact startled the intruder, and I heard footsteps retreating into the woods. Breathing heavily, I waited for any sign of return. Minutes passed like hours. When everything remained quiet, I dared to hope that it was over. Sleep was out of the question. So I sat vigil until dawn, clutching the kitchen knife with a white-knuckled grip. As the first light seeped through the windows, I decided to step outside and assess the damage. The door was splintered, hanging ajar from its hinges. On the ground lay a heavy piece of timber, likely used to batter the door. But what caught my attention was a symbol carved into the wood, a crude drawing of an eye with a slash through it. I snapped a photo with my phone, thinking it might be useful evidence. Just then I heard voices in the distance, multiple people talking and laughing. Relief washed over me. Other campers, perhaps? I headed toward the sound, hoping to find help. As I approached, I realized the voices were coming from a small group gathered around a makeshift campsite. They were an odd bunch, dressed in ragged clothes, their faces smudged with dirt. They fell silent as soon as they noticed me. "Morning," I said cautiously. "Did you folks happen to see anyone around here last night?" One of them, a tall man with a tangled beard, stepped forward. "No one but us out here," he replied, his gaze steady and unblinking. I noticed something unsettling. The same eye symbol from the timber was tattooed on his forearm. A knot tightened in my stomach. "Interesting tattoo," I remarked, trying to keep my tone light. He glanced at his arm. "It's more than a tattoo," he said. "Right. Well, if you see anyone suspicious, let me know. Someone tried to break into my RV last night." He gave a faint smile. "The forest doesn't take kindly to trespassers." I decided it was time to leave. "All right then. Have a good day." As I turned to walk away, I felt their eyes on my back like a physical weight. And that's when I knew I had stumbled into something truly dangerous. As I hurried back to my RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled into something dangerous. I resolved to pack up and get out of there as fast as possible. When I returned, I found my RV ransacked. Drawers were pulled out, belongings scattered, and the words "Leave now" were scrawled across the wall in what looked like charcoal. My heart pounded in my chest. This was no longer just a creepy encounter. It was a direct threat. I gathered what I could and started the engine. As I drove down the dirt road leading out of the park, I caught sight of something in the rearview mirror. The group from earlier, standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave. Just when I thought I was safe, a loud bang echoed from the side of the RV. The vehicle lurched, and I struggled to keep it on the road. I looked out the window to see one of my tires blown out. I cursed under my breath. Pulling over to assess the damage, I found the tire shredded. Upon closer inspection, I saw a makeshift spike strip embedded with nails lying nearby. This was deliberate. Out of nowhere, a figure tackled me, knocking me to the ground. It was the bearded man from the campsite. He held a knife, his eyes wild with intent. We grappled, adrenaline fueling my movements. He slashed at me, grazing my arm. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, dodging another attack. "Outsiders aren't welcome here," he snarled. I kicked at his knee, causing him to stumble. Seizing the opportunity, I scrambled back toward the RV, but another member of the group appeared, blocking my path. She swung a metal pipe at me. I ducked, and it smashed into the RV's side mirror. Desperate, I remembered the flare gun still tucked into my belt. I pulled it out and aimed it at them. "Back off!" They hesitated, eyeing the weapon. The woman sneered, "That toy won't save you." She advanced. Without thinking, I fired. The flare struck her shoulder, igniting her clothes. She screamed, dropping to the ground to extinguish the flames. The bearded man charged at me in a rage. I sidestepped, causing him to crash into the side of the RV. The impact dazed him. I took the chance to climb into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. I started the engine. Despite the flat tire, the RV lurched forward, grinding against the road. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. As I sped down the rough path, the vehicle shook violently, the other tires threatening to give out. But I pushed on. In the distance, I saw a ranger station. Relief flooded over me. I pulled up haphazardly, honking the horn wildly. A park ranger emerged, alarmed by the sight of my battered RV and my disheveled state. "Please, I need help," I shouted. He approached cautiously. "Calm down, sir. What's going on?" "A group of people attacked me. They're back there, sabotaging the road and attacking campers." His expression grew serious. "Did you say a group?" "Yes, they tried to break into my RV last night and attack me on the road." He radioed for backup. "You're lucky you made it here. We've had reports of a cult operating in the remote areas of the park." "A cult? They're hostile to outsiders. We've been trying to track them down." Another ranger arrived, and they escorted me inside, tending to my wounds. I gave a full account of what happened, showing them the photo of the symbol and describing the attackers. Over the next few hours, law enforcement combed the area. They found the spike strip and evidence of the group's campsite, but the cult members had disappeared. I was advised to stay in town until they could ensure the area was safe. They arranged for my RV to be repaired, and I checked into a local motel. At the motel, the receptionist looked up as I approached the desk. "Rough day?" she asked, eyeing my torn sleeve and bandaged arm. "You could say that," I replied. "I've had better Mondays. At least I didn't have to sit through a budget meeting." She chuckled. "Well, we've got cable and hot water. Sometimes that's all you need. Throw in a decent cup of coffee, and you might just convince me to stay forever." The following day, news came in. Authorities had discovered several shallow graves near where my RV had been parked. The bodies of missing hikers were recovered, victims of the cult's gruesome acts. I realized how close I'd come to becoming one of them. As for the cult, they remained at large. Their leader, identified as Marcus Hale, was a former survivalist with a history of violent offenses. He had gathered a group of like-minded individuals preying on unsuspecting campers and hikers. I decided it was time to head home. The allure of the wilderness had lost its charm. Before leaving, I thanked the rangers for their help and provided any additional information they needed. Then I drove out of Alaska, the roads stretching ahead like a promise of safety. As I left, I couldn't help but think about Marcus Hale, a man who had turned his back on society, choosing isolation and violence over humanity. I drove on, the open road ahead, leaving the shadows of the forest and its secrets behind. The forest around me was too quiet. I'd been sitting by the campfire outside my RV, immersed in the silence for hours, but now something felt off. The kind of off you feel in your gut before your brain catches up to what's happening. No wind, no rustling in the leaves, just dead stillness. That was the first thing I noticed when I pulled up to this remote campsite deep in Mount Hood National Forest. A place like this should have been full of life. Birds, insects, something. But the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the radio I'd brought along. I needed quiet after everything that had happened over the past year. I wasn't looking for distractions, just isolation. After my wife's death, nothing made sense anymore. People kept telling me I needed to move on, but the noise of life, the sympathy, the well-meaning advice, the friends who didn't know what to say, became unbearable. So I packed up and hit the road, hoping the wilderness would give me space to think, or maybe stop thinking altogether. I thought the forest would help. It had, until now. The radio's static broke the silence, a sudden burst of garbled noise that made me jump. I turned my head toward the RV where the old ham radio sat inside. I hadn't even touched the thing in hours. It was an antique I'd brought along to mess around with in my downtime, but the signal had been dead all day. No stations, no chatter, nothing. Until now. I stood up from the fire, walked over to the RV, and ducked inside to check the radio. The static was louder, more insistent, like it was trying to form words but couldn't quite get there. I twisted the dials, searching for a clearer signal, but all I got was more white noise. Then, through the crackling, I heard it, a voice, faint and garbled, speaking numbers. 1, 3, 7, 8, 9. The numbers repeated over and over, mechanical and cold, like a voice from an old number station. It didn't make sense. I was miles from anywhere, and this was supposed to be a dead zone, no signal, no interference. The voice paused for a moment, then the numbers started again. 1, 3, 7. It sent a chill through me, but I told myself it was just some rogue signal bouncing off the atmosphere. Maybe a military transmission. There were logical explanations for this kind of thing. I was sure of it. But the way the numbers repeated over and over felt wrong. Like the message wasn't for just anyone. It was for me. I shut the radio off. My fingers were trembling slightly. I wasn't here for this. I needed quiet, not some weird radio signal rattling around in my head. The next day I tried to forget about the radio. I spent the morning hiking through the woods. The towering pines loomed overhead like silent giants. The air was cool and damp, the sky just a sliver of gray through the dense canopy. But something gnawed at me, a faint buzzing at the back of my mind. No birds, no animals. just silence. When I returned to the campsite, the radio was on again, static from the speakers. I hadn't touched it. I stepped inside the RV, staring at the radio like it might come to life. The static was louder now, more intense. I could feel it in my bones, like the vibration from a low hum in the ground. And beneath the static, the numbers were back. 1, 3, 7, 8. I slammed my hand down on the off switch, killing the sound. My pulse was racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be a glitch, something with the wiring, maybe a stray electrical signal. I'd worked with enough technology over the years to know that things sometimes did strange things when you weren't looking. But the numbers, the way they were so clear, so deliberate, I shook it off and stepped back outside, trying to push the growing unease away. That's when I noticed the man standing at the edge of my campsite. I hadn't heard him approach. He was just there, tall, scruffy, wearing a weathered jacket and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked like a camper, but there was something about the way he stood, stiff and tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. "Hey!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You lost?" The man looked at me, his face tight with anxiety. "I heard it too," he said. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Heard what?" "The signal, the numbers," he said, glancing toward the RV. "I've been picking it up on my own radio. It's not normal." My mouth went dry. "You've heard it too?" The man nodded. "I'm Ben," he said, stepping closer, his voice low. "I was camping a few miles down the road. I've been getting static, voices, weird electrical interference. My GPS stopped working, my cell phone drained to 0 in minutes." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "What do you think it is?" Ben shook his head, his eyes darting toward the trees. "I don't know, but it's not natural. The way the signal moves, it's like it's getting closer." I didn't know how to respond to that. I was a man of logic, of science. Signals were signals. Glitches were glitches. But there was something about the way Ben spoke, the fear in his eyes, that made my skin crawl. That night, the radio came to life again. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the campfire and the peaceful silence of the woods, but the static was louder than before. The numbers were clearer, more insistent. 1, 3, 7, 8. Ben was sitting across from me, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. His eyes constantly scanned the dark forest around us. He hadn't relaxed since he showed up, and I couldn't blame him. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. "You think it's some kind of broadcast?" I asked, more to fill the silence than anything. Ben shook his head. "I don't think it's a broadcast at all." "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I think it's a warning or a signal from something out there." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A warning from what? Before I could ask, the static on the radio cut out for a moment. There was only silence, the kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes your skin prickle with anticipation. Then a sound, a soft rhythmic clicking, like something metallic tapping against wood. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam only revealed darkness. The clicking grew louder, echoing through the forest, and then through the radio a voice crackled to life. "We see you." My blood ran cold. Ben's eyes widened, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The voice repeated, distorted and mechanical, "We see you." I stood up, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The clicking sound was closer now, coming from all around us, moving through the trees. The forest seemed to pulse with energy, the air growing thick and heavy, like the atmosphere itself was alive. "I think we should leave," Ben said, his voice tight with fear. For once, I agreed. The next morning, I found Ben's tent abandoned. His gear was scattered around the clearing, but there was no sign of him, no footprints, no note. Just the cold, empty forest and the low hum of static that had settled into the air like a living thing. I tried to follow his tracks, but they vanished in the thick underbrush. It was like he'd walked into the trees and disappeared. The GPS on my phone was useless, spinning me in circles. The battery drained faster than I'd ever seen. The static in my ears grew louder the further I went, like the signal was inside my head, vibrating through my skull. The numbers were back too, repeating over and over, etched into my mind. 1, 3, 7. By midday, I stumbled across something I hadn't expected, an old, dilapidated radio tower hidden deep in the woods. The metal was rusted, vines crawling up the sides. but it was still faintly humming with power. I climbed the tower, every step echoing in the stillness. My heart hammered in my chest. At the top, I found the source of the signal, a small glowing device pulsing with an eerie cold light. It didn't belong here, it wasn't part of the original tower. It was something else, something foreign. I reached out and touched it, and the static in my head exploded. The numbers, the clicking, the voices, it all crashed into me at once. An unbearable cacophony of sound. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the tower as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The lights returned, flickering in the trees, cold and mechanical. The clicking grew louder, more frantic, like something was chasing me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV, but the lights followed me. The clicking never far behind, but I managed to get inside and slam the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the device still clutched in my hand. As I drove away, the static began to fade, but the numbers never left me. They echoed in my mind, a constant whisper, even as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror. It's been days now, and I'm still hearing them. 1, 3, 7. I can't get them out of my head, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever sent that signal, knows where I am, and it's not done with me yet. I had been staring at the sinkhole for hours. The edges of the earth had crumbled away into a perfect jagged circle, leaving nothing but a gaping void beneath me. It was unnervingly symmetrical, as though the ground hadn't collapsed on its own, but had been carved out by something, or someone. I crouched at the edge, carefully adjusting my geological scanner, but the equipment was giving me nothing but static. The readings were all over the place. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered, tapping the scanner in frustration. I hadn't come all the way to Hollow Creek for faulty data. I took a deep breath and scanned the horizon. The thick pines loomed like sentinels around the campground, their pale light of late afternoon casting long shadows across the landscape. My RV sat parked a short distance away, looking small and vulnerable against the vast wilderness of Chugach National Forest. It was a beautiful place, no doubt. Quiet, remote, exactly what I needed to clear my head. But the silence had a weight to it, an unnatural stillness that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I was here on a solo trip, tasked with investigating the sudden appearance of several sinkholes that had been forming in the area. Geological instability was the theory, but something about the way these holes formed had raised red flags from the moment I arrived. The patterns were too precise, too deliberate. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Ethan, the local park ranger, and the closest thing to human contact I'd had in days. His voice crackled through the static as I picked up. "Hey Megan, how's it going out there?" "Not great," I admitted. "The equipment's glitching again, and these sinkholes, I don't know, they feel weird, not like anything I've seen before." Ethan chuckled, but there was an edge to it. "Hollow Creek's always been strange. You wouldn't be the first to think something's off here." "What do you mean?" I asked, standing up and dusting off my jeans. "You ever hear the stories about this place?" Locals believe the sinkholes are more than just geological shifts. They think there's something ancient beneath the earth. The indigenous people used to call it the land that breathes. They thought the earth here was alive, that it could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. I rolled my eyes, though the words stirred an uneasy feeling deep in my gut. Sounds like folklore to me. "Maybe," Ethan said, his tone serious now. "But I'd be careful if I were you. These woods have a way of playing tricks on you, and the sinkholes, well, they've taken people before. People who didn't listen to the warnings." I didn't respond right away, staring down into the abyss of the sinkhole in front of me. I'd studied rocks and underground formations for most of my career, but nothing had prepared me for the unnerving stillness of this place. "Thanks for the heads up," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "But I'm here to study geology, not ghosts." Ethan sighed. "Just don't go too deep, okay? Call if you need anything." I hung up and pocketed the phone, but the conversation lingered in my mind. The land that breathes. Superstition, I told myself. Just old stories. I turned back to the sinkhole. Something inside me itched to see what was beneath the surface, to understand what was causing the ground to shift in such a strange, unnatural way. The patterns in the rocks I had been studying weren't like any natural formation I'd seen before. There were spirals, perfectly etched into the stone as though by design, not by nature. The deeper I looked, the more I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I wasn't meant to find. That night, the first signs of trouble came in the form of noise, a low, deep rumbling that vibrated through the ground like the hum of a giant unseen machine. It started just as I was finishing dinner, sitting by the campfire. The sounds blended into the whispering wind at first, but then it grew louder, more distinct, like a deep pulse coming from below. I stood, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. The stars were barely visible, shrouded in the thick clouds that seemed to roll in out of nowhere. The fire flickered, casting eerie shadows on the trees. For a moment, I thought I heard footsteps, something moving in the dark. "Ethan?" I called, my voice small against the vast silence. Nothing. I walked toward the sinkhole, my stomach nodding with every step. The rumbling grew louder, and as I reached the edge, I felt it, vibrations under my feet. The ground beneath me was shifting, alive. I shone my flashlight down into the hole, but the beam disappeared into the blackness, swallowed by the depths. I knelt, running my hand along the edge. The earth was soft, loose, as though it had only recently begun to settle after something had disturbed it. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way. I scrambled backward, heart racing, just as a section of the earth collapsed, sending a cascade of dirt and rocks into the sinkhole. I fell onto my back, gasping for air, watching as the hole grew wider, deeper, like a hungry mouth devouring the ground. Adrenaline pumped through me as I backed away, my mind racing. I needed to get out of here. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a geological phenomenon. Something was moving beneath the surface, something massive. I rushed back to the RV, the flashlight beam bouncing erratically as I fumbled for the key. But as I reached the door, the ground shook again, harder this time. The sinkhole was growing fast. I had to leave now. But then a thought struck me. What if I was right? What if this was something no one had ever discovered before? If I could just capture proof, if I could document what was really happening here, my work would be revolutionary. I would be vindicated. My mind flashed back to the spirals in the rock, the patterns that had seemed too deliberate to be natural. There was something ancient beneath the earth, and I was so close. I grabbed my gear and rushed back to the edge of the sinkhole. My heart pounded in my chest as I descended carefully into the darkness, lowering myself into the opening. The air grew colder as I went deeper. The walls of the hole were damp and slick beneath my hands. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the bottom. The cavern was vast, much larger than I had anticipated. My flashlight illuminated jagged rock formations, but it was the carvings on the walls that caught my breath. Symbols, spirals etched deep into the stone. They were everywhere, ancient and deliberate. This wasn't just a natural formation. This was a structure, a temple of some kind, buried deep beneath the earth for centuries, maybe longer. I pulled out my camera, hands trembling, and began to record. But as I did, a low, resonating sound filled the cavern, a rhythmic pulse like the beating of a massive heart. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, the ground shifting beneath my feet. And then from the shadows I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming from the deeper recesses of the cavern. Something was moving toward me. Something massive. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the stone walls. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. Whatever was in the darkness, it was getting closer. I could feel its presence, a weight in the air, a primal force that made my skin crawl. The footsteps stopped, and then a deep, guttural growl echoed through the cavern. I ran. I didn't look back. The ground trembled beneath me as I scrambled up the wall of the sinkhole, my hands slipping on the loose earth. The growling grew louder, closer, until I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck. I burst out of the sinkhole, gasping for air, and ran toward the RV. The ground shook violently, and as I reached the door, I glanced back. The sinkhole was collapsing in on itself, the earth swallowing it whole. But for a split second, I saw something massive, serpentine, rising from the depths before it disappeared into the darkness. I didn't wait. I threw open the door, started the engine, and sped away, leaving Hollow Creek behind me. By the time I reached the main road, my heart had finally begun to slow. I was alive. I had made it. But the images of that cavern, those symbols, haunted my mind. I had uncovered something ancient, something that wasn't meant to be found. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something that should have stayed buried. Something that was still there, waiting beneath the earth. And I knew one thing for certain, I wouldn't be going back. The first thing you need to know about me is that I love fishing. I'm not one of those guys who just like to say they fish and then sit around drinking beer all day. No, I actually go out there on the banks of the river, rod in hand, and wait for that sweet tug on the line. It's a kind of therapy for me, a break from all the madness. My name's Brian Patel, by the way, and this story takes place back in 1987. I grew up in the Midwest, where fishing is more than just a pastime. It's practically a way of life. My old man taught me everything I know. He wasn't the nicest guy, but he knew his way around a fishing pole. I suppose that's where my love for it began. My personal life? Well, let's just say I've had my share of ups and downs. Divorced, no kids, a small circle of friends. I worked jobs here and there, nothing too stable. But fishing? That was the one constant. So, there I was, in the middle of nowhere in North Dakota, standing on the edge of the Red River. This spot was a gem I discovered a few months prior. Hardly anyone around, peaceful as hell, and the fish were plenty. I had my tackle box and my favorite rod. The sky was clear, the water calm, and everything seemed perfect. It was early morning, just after dawn. The river was shrouded in a light mist, giving it an almost mystical appearance. I cast my line and settled down in my usual spot on a large, flat rock. I'd caught a couple of good-sized catfish already, and was feeling pretty pleased with myself. That's when I noticed something strange. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw what looked like a large animal moving through the trees on the opposite bank. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but the damn mist made it hard to see. I brushed it off, thinking it was probably just a deer or something. Time passed, and I was lost in the rhythmic casting and reeling. It wasn't until I heard a splash that I looked up again. There it was, across the river, closer this time. It wasn't a deer. It was something much larger, and its movements were deliberate, almost calculated. My heart started to race a bit, but I tried to keep my cool. Probably just a bear, I muttered to myself. Just stay on your side, buddy. But the thing didn't stay on its side. It slipped into the water and began to swim across. Now, I've seen my fair share of wildlife, but this was something different. It moved through the water with a grace that didn't match its bulk. I could make out rough, leathery hide and what looked like scales. My stomach did a little flip. The creature emerged on my side of the river, shaking water off its massive frame. It stood on all fours, but it was as tall as a man. Its head was like that of a lizard, with a long snout and rows of sharp teeth. The eyes were the worst part, cold, dark, and calculating. This was no bear. I scrambled back, my fishing rod forgotten. The creature didn't seem to notice me at first. It sniffed the air, then began to move toward me with a predatory grace that made my blood run cold. I've never felt fear like that before. I could see the muscles rippling under its hide as it walked, the claws on its feet digging into the earth. "Holy," I whispered. "What the hell are you?" Now you'd think a guy like me, who spent so much time in nature, would be packing some heat. But no, I'd left my shotgun at home. I always figured the worst thing I'd encounter out here was a rabid raccoon or a pissed-off beaver. This thing was way out of my league. I started backing away slowly, hoping to reach my truck. I'd parked it a little way off, thinking the walk would be good exercise. Stupid move. The creature's head snapped in my direction, and it let out a sound that was halfway between a hiss and a growl. I nearly pissed myself. All right, I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just stay calm, Brian. It's just an animal. You've faced worse." But the truth was, I hadn't. This thing was like nothing I'd ever seen. It started moving toward me. Faster now. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the wet grass. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush. My heart was pounding. My lungs felt like they were going to burst. I reached the tree line and kept running, branches whipping at my face. I could hear the creature getting closer, its breath hot on my heels. Then I spotted an old, dilapidated cabin up ahead. Probably abandoned. Without thinking, I bolted for it. I slammed into the door with my shoulder and it gave way with a creak. I stumbled inside and kicked the door shut, fumbling for something to barricade it with. There wasn't much, a broken chair, some old crates. I shoved everything I could find against the door, then backed away, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. The cabin was dark, the air thick with dust and the smell of rot. I found a rusty hatchet hanging on the wall and grabbed it, my hands shaking. The creature was outside now, circling the cabin. I could hear its claws scratching at the wood, testing for a weak spot. My mind raced. How the hell was I going to get out of this? There was a small window on the far side of the cabin. Maybe, just maybe, I could slip out and make a run for it. I crept over, trying to stay quiet. The window was grimy, but I could see the outline of the trees outside. I started to pry it open, wincing as it squealed in protest. Suddenly, there was a loud crash. The creature had thrown its weight against the door. The barricade was starting to give. I doubled my efforts, wrenching the window open just enough to squeeze through. I was halfway out when the door gave way with a splintering crack. I looked back and saw it. The creature's head pushed through the gap, its eyes locking onto mine. There was no mistaking the hunger in those eyes. It wanted me, and it was going to get me. I twisted and kicked, pushing myself through the window and falling to the ground outside. I hit the dirt hard, the wind knocked out of me. I struggled to my feet, gasping for air. The creature was right behind me, clawing its way through the window. I didn't wait to see if it would fit. I took off, running again, my legs burning with the effort. I could see the river up ahead. Maybe if I could make it to the water, I could lose the creature. I crashed through the underbrush, lungs on fire. I could hear it behind me. Closer now. The river was just ahead. I could see the glint of the water through the trees. I burst out of the trees and onto the riverbank. Without thinking, I dove into the water. The cold hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I swam with everything I had. I glanced back and saw the creature on the bank, pacing back and forth. It let out a roar of frustration, and I knew I'd made the right call. I kept swimming until I reached the other side. I dragged myself onto the shore, collapsing in a heap. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What the hell was that thing? And why was it after me? I forced myself to get up. I couldn't stay here. I needed to get to my truck and get the hell out of here. I stumbled through the trees, my body aching. It felt like hours before I finally saw the glint of my truck in the distance. I reached the truck and yanked the door open, fumbling with the keys. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I floored it, tearing down the dirt road as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a moment, trying to calm down. My mind was a mess, replaying the events of the day over and over. I needed to tell someone, but who would believe me? I decided to go to the police. Maybe they could make sense of it. I drove to the station and stumbled inside, looking like I'd been through hell. The officer at the desk looked up, his eyes widening as he took in my appearance. "Jesus, what happened to you?" he asked. I don't even know where to start, I said, my voice shaking. "There's something out there in the woods. It's not an animal. It's something else. It tried to kill me." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "All right, take a seat. Let's hear your story." I told him everything, from the moment I saw the creature to my escape across the river. He listened, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. "That's quite a tale," he said, "but you're not the first one to report something strange out there. We've had a few missing persons cases in that area, folks who went out into the woods and never came back." My blood ran cold. "So, you believe me?" He nodded. "I believe you saw something. What it is, I don't know, but we'll send a team out there to investigate." I spent the night in a motel, too shaken to drive home. The next morning, I went back to the police station to see if they'd found anything. The officer I'd spoken to was waiting for me. "We sent a team out to the area you described," he said. "They found the cabin, and they found tracks, but whatever it was, it's gone now." "Gone?" I asked, my stomach sinking. He nodded. "We're keeping an eye on the area, but for now it looks like you're safe." Safe. The word felt hollow. I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. I left the station and headed home, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. What was that creature? Where had it come from, and why had it targeted me? I never found the answers to those questions, but I stopped fishing at the Red River. Some things are better left alone. In the weeks that followed, I tried to get back to my normal routine, but the memory of that day haunted me. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced I could hear the creature's claws scratching at my door. I eventually moved away from North Dakota, hoping to put some distance between myself and that nightmare. I settled in a small town in Colorado, far from any rivers or dense forests. I made new friends, got a steady job, and tried to rebuild my life. But I never forgot. Sometimes late at night, I'd find myself staring out the window, half expecting to see those cold, dark eyes staring back at me. I told myself it was all in my head, just a bad dream. But deep down, I knew better. The world is full of mysteries, and not all of them are meant to be understood. Some things are better left unexplored, left to the shadows where they belong. And as for me, I'll stick to fishing in well-populated areas from now on. Some lines are better left uncrossed. Years later, I heard rumors of strange sightings in other parts of the country. People disappearing, strange creatures spotted in the woods. Each story sent a chill down my spine, a reminder of that day by the Red River. I'd listen to the reports, shaking my head, feeling a strange sense of kinship with those who had encountered the unknown. I never went back to North Dakota, never returned to the Red River. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, I'd think about that creature and wonder, was it still out there, lurking in the shadows? Or had it moved on, searching for its next victim? I'd never know for sure. One thing was certain, though. That day had changed me. I'd seen the darker side of nature, the hidden corners of the world where the unknown lurked. And I'd learned to respect it, to keep my distance, and to remember that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we can't explain. Life went on, and I found peace in the simple things. I made new memories, found new joys, and left the past behind. But I never forgot the lesson I'd learned by the Red River. Some stories don't have neat, tidy endings. Some nightmares don't end when you wake up. And sometimes the only thing you can do is move forward, one step at a time, and hope that the darkness doesn't follow. My name's Kate Adams, and this happened back in 2019 on the coast near Cannon Beach, Oregon. I had just bought an old RV and thought it'd be a good idea to break it in with a solo camping trip. I had this job back in Eugene at a car repair shop, and it didn't pay great. So buying that RV was the best and dumbest thing I'd done in years. Dumb because it guzzled gas like it was still 1972, but it had character, you know? Felt like I was driving a tank of freedom. Cannon Beach was only about 3 hours away, a popular spot, but I'd managed to find a little-known area off the main path, somewhere a bit more rugged and off the beaten trail. Fewer people meant less noise, which was perfect for me. The air was crisp, the waves a constant hum in the background, and I was hoping to recharge a little, just me in the wild for a couple of days. I even told a couple of friends as a half joke, if you don't hear from me by Tuesday, start worrying. The spot was tucked into a curve of the shoreline, framed by rocks and a cliff that gave it a secluded feel. The nearest camper was maybe half a mile up the coast, and beyond that, a dense line of trees hugged the rocky landscape. I parked, set up my chair by the door, and cracked open a beer. The RV wasn't perfect, but I thought I'd fix it up eventually, maybe even put in some solar panels if the job at the shop started paying better. Just as the sun dipped down, turning everything this deep, blood-red hue, I noticed a small, faded tent down on the beach. It was barely holding up against the wind, and I wondered if some kids had left it behind, or if maybe someone had taken off into the woods for a while. But the tent looked too worn, as if it had been abandoned for longer than just a night or two. My curiosity got the better of me, so I took a stroll, sand sticking to my boots, and made my way over. The tent flap was open, and it looked like someone had dumped a couple of sleeping bags and a backpack inside. But it wasn't just any sleeping bag. It looked like someone had tried tearing into it with a knife. The material was shredded, as if the owner had been trying to make it into something else or had been in a panic to get out. The backpack was half empty, with a few random clothes strewn about and some canned food with rust spots forming. It looked like the setup hadn't been touched in weeks, if not months. I'll admit I was creeped out. There was something off about the scene, too quiet, as if it had been frozen in time and just left there, like the remnants of some weird ritual. I was about to leave when I noticed a small notebook tucked into the corner of the backpack. I flipped it open, and the first page had scribbled words that didn't make much sense. Mostly random notes, dates, and then one phrase. He comes at night. Now, that should have been the moment when I turned around, packed up my RV, and headed back to Eugene. But curiosity got the better of me. Besides, I'd seen enough horror movies to know the stupid moves, and I figured as long as I stayed cautious, I'd be fine. I tossed the notebook back in the tent and made my way up to the RV, shaking off the weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. I spent the rest of the evening tinkering with the RV's old heater and cooking up some canned stew. The thought of that abandoned camp didn't leave me, though. It hung around, itching at the back of my mind. Around 10, I locked up the RV and settled in, but sleep was hard to come by. The ocean's rhythm usually had this calming effect, but tonight it sounded distant, hollow. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a thudding sound. It was faint at first, like something tapping on metal. My first thought was that it was a branch from a tree hitting the RV, but there weren't any trees that close. I reached for my flashlight, switched it on, and swept the beam across the small cabin. Nothing seemed out of place, but the thudding continued. Steady, almost like it was getting closer. I got out of bed, my heart thumping harder than I'd like to admit. Grabbing the flashlight tighter, I crept to the door and listened. The night was still, save for the distant rush of waves. But there it was again, a soft, deliberate tapping right against the back of the RV. I took a deep breath, swung the door open, and stepped outside. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and that's when I saw him. He was crouched down by the back of the RV, running his fingers along the bumper, almost like he was inspecting it. He was a big guy, tall and bony, with a shock of messy gray hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in months. His face was gaunt, sunken in, like he'd been out here a lot longer than anyone should be. I froze, unsure of whether to shout or stay quiet. But before I could decide, he looked up, locking onto me with this hollow, distant stare. He didn't say anything, just straightened up, his frame towering in the flashlight's beam. And then he smiled. This twisted, almost mocking grin sent a chill straight through me. "Nice RV you got there," he finally said, his voice dry and cracked. "Looks like it could use some work." I managed to force a laugh, something weak to break the tension, and told him I was just here for a couple of days. He tilted his head, still grinning, and took a step closer. I could see that his hands were smeared with something dark, dirt, I hoped, though it didn't quite look like it. "You should leave," he muttered, more to himself than to me, as he ran his hand along the edge of the RV, almost possessively. "It's a bad place to stay the night. Folks around here, they don't take kindly to strangers." I didn't wait to find out what he meant. I muttered something about packing up soon and started backing away, keeping the flashlight on him. He didn't follow, just stood there watching as I climbed back into the RV and locked the door behind me. My pulse was racing, my mind buzzing with thoughts of what I'd just seen. I had planned to stay a couple more nights, but that guy had thrown every bit of relaxation I'd hoped for out the window. I sat up for the next few hours, just listening, clutching the only weapon I had. A rusted old wrench I'd been meaning to replace. Every creak and rustle outside felt magnified, like he was still out there, circling, waiting. Finally, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a restless sleep. It couldn't have been more than an hour later when I woke up to a scratching sound. This time it was coming from the door, a faint scraping noise, like someone running a blade along the metal. My heart dropped, and I gripped the wrench tighter, barely breathing. The scratching stopped, and then there was a low whisper. My blood ran cold as I heard the man's voice, soft and chilling, right outside the door. "Let me in, buddy. Let me see what you've done to my RV." I forced myself to stay silent, hoping he'd give up and leave. But the whispering continued, nonsensical rambling about fixing things and making it right. When the morning came, I packed up fast. I didn't look back until I saw him in the rearview mirror. He was standing at the edge of the trees, grinning that twisted grin, his hands still stained. I sold the RV the next day, never went back to Cannon Beach, never camped alone again, and sometimes on quiet nights, I still wonder if he's out there, waiting. I hadn't planned on staying at Stillwater Grove. The campground wasn't even marked on my map, just a small patch of green near the edge of Shawnee National Forest. But as I drove down the empty forest road, I saw the sign. Old, weathered wood with the words, Stillwater Grove Campground carved into it. It felt like an invitation, one I couldn't resist. I'd been on the road for weeks, photographing wildlife for a personal project I'd picked up after quitting my job. The last few months had been a blur of long drives, lonely campsites, and an overwhelming need to be anywhere but back in the city. I didn't miss my corporate job or my ex. What I did miss was the feeling that I knew what the hell I was doing with my life. Stillwater Grove seemed perfect, quiet, isolated, and right by the lake. It would give me the break I needed, some peace before heading back into the real world. When I pulled into the campsite, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grove. The air was still, the only sound being the gentle lapping of water against the shore. A single RV sat on the far side of the campground, a distant figure moving near it. Otherwise, it was just me. I parked my RV near the edge of the lake, the water glistening under the fading light. After setting up camp, I grabbed my camera and headed toward the shore, hoping to catch the sunset. As I stood there, framing the perfect shot, a voice startled me. Beautiful, isn't it? I turned to see a woman standing a few feet away, her face half in shadow. She had an otherworldly kind of beauty, pale skin, long dark hair, and eyes that seemed to take in everything. Yeah, I replied, lowering my camera. It's peaceful. She smiled. It always is here. I'm Ellie, by the way. Nick, I said, shaking her outstretched hand. Her skin was cold, like she'd been standing in the shade for too long. You camping here too? For a little while, she said, her voice soft. I come here every now and then. Can't stay away. Her words sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. I wasn't used to talking to people much anymore. The solitude had become my comfort zone, and something about Ellie felt out of place. You here for the fishing? I asked, trying to make small talk. She shook her head. No, just the lake, the quiet. We stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The sky turned shades of pink and orange, the water reflecting the colors like a mirror. I raised my camera, snapping a few shots, and when I looked back, Ellie was gone. Just like that. I glanced around, but there was no sign of her. The other RV was still parked at the far end of the grove, but there was no movement. I chalked it up to her being quick on her feet, though it left me feeling oddly unsettled. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, making the trees outside rustle against each other like whispered secrets. I rolled over in bed, trying to find a comfortable position, but something felt off. The RV was too cold, colder than it should have been. I checked the thermostat, but everything seemed normal. Still, the chill lingered. I grabbed a blanket and tried to force myself to sleep. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first, like a woman's voice carried on the wind. I sat up listening, but it was gone. Just my imagination, I thought. Long days alone in the woods will do that to you. But then I heard it again. This time it was clearer, a soft, melodic humming coming from outside. I climbed out of bed, grabbing my flashlight. My breath fogged up in the cold air as I stepped outside the RV, scanning the campsite. Nothing, just the stillness of the lake and the trees swaying gently in the wind. But the humming persisted, coming from near the water's edge. I walked toward the shore, the beam of my flashlight dancing over the ground. And that's when I saw her. A woman in white, standing at the edge of the lake, her back to me. Her long, dark hair hung loose down her back, swaying slightly as she hummed that haunting tune. Ellie, I called out, my voice shaking. She didn't turn. She just stood there, motionless, her gaze fixed on the water. Something about the way she stood, so still, so rigid, set my nerves on edge. I took a step closer, the flashlight illuminating her pale figure. But as soon as the light touched her, she vanished. I blinked, stunned. 1 second she'd been there, and the next, she was gone. The water rippled where she'd been standing, but otherwise the lake was empty. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was that? I hurried back to the RV, locking the door behind me. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps. My hands were shaking. I didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural nonsense, but what I'd seen, it wasn't right. I had seen her. I knew I had. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to rationalize what had happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of that woman standing by the lake. The next morning, I found Ellie near the grove, sitting by a small campfire. She smiled when she saw me, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Rough night?" she asked, as if she already knew. "Yeah," I said, sitting down across from her. "I saw something last night, a woman by the lake. I thought it was you, but she wasn't there when you got close." Ellie finished, her voice calm, too calm. "The Lady of Stillwater." "The what?" I asked, feeling a chill run through me. Ellie looked at me, her eyes dark and hollow. "She's been here for a long time, longer than the campground, longer than the trees. She drowned in the lake, or so the story goes. Some say she was waiting for someone, her lover, I think, but he never showed." I stared at her, my stomach twisting. "You're telling me she's a ghost?" Ellie shrugged. "Call it what you want, but she's real, and now that you've seen her, she won't let you go." I laughed, though it came out shaky. "That's insane, is it?" Ellie asked, her gaze locking onto mine. "You saw her. You know she's real." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died in my throat. I had seen her, and it hadn't been a trick of the light or my imagination. Something had been there, something that shouldn't have been. "What does she want?" I asked quietly. Ellie's eyes flicked toward the lake. "She wants what she's always wanted, to take someone with her into the water." That night the sound started again. At first it was the soft humming drifting through the night air, then the splashing, gentle, rhythmic, like someone wading through the water. I lay in bed, my heart racing, my body tense. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to see her again. But the pull was stronger this time. A strange compulsion tugged at me, drawing me toward the lake. I tried to fight it, to stay in the RV, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me outside into the cold night air. The lake was calm, reflecting the pale moonlight, and there she was, standing in the water, her white dress billowing around her as if moved by an unseen current. "Come to me," she whispered, her voice soft but clear. "Please, come." I took a step forward, my body moving against my will. The water lapped at my shoes, and I could feel the cold seeping into my skin. "Come with me," she said again, her voice almost pleading now. "I've waited so long." I fought to resist, to break free from whatever force was drawing me in. But my feet kept moving, the water now up to my knees, freezing cold. I could feel the pull of the lake, the weight of the water dragging me down. Suddenly a hand grabbed my arm, yanking me back with such force that I stumbled onto the shore. Ellie stood beside me, her face pale, her grip strong. "You have to leave," she said, her voice urgent now, "before it's too late." I looked back at the lake, but the woman was gone. The water was still, as if nothing had happened. I gasped, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Ellie's expression was grim. "She's marked you now. If you stay, she'll take you. You have to go." I didn't argue. I packed up my things, my hands shaking, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Within minutes, I was back in the RV, starting the engine and pulling out of the campsite as fast as I could. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Ellie stood at the edge of the grove, watching me go, her face unreadable. And behind her, just barely visible in the mist, was the Lady of Stillwater. Her pale eyes following me, waiting for me to return. I didn't look back again. My name is Hendrix Coleman, and this happened to me on June 16th, 2009. I worked as a search and rescue officer in the dense forests of northern Idaho. My team and I were called out to find a missing hiker, Dave Mattingly, who had been out for 2 days with no sign of returning. We got the call around 7 a.m., and by 8:30 we were deep into the woods. The area was rugged with thick underbrush and towering pines. It wasn't a popular spot, mainly frequented by locals who knew how to navigate its labyrinthine paths. Dave had set out on his hike alone. According to his wife, he was experienced, but had a habit of wandering off the main trails. His wife, Marcy, mentioned that he always carried a pocket knife and a small first aid kit, but nothing more. No gun, no radio. We geared up with the usual radios, first aid kits, maps, and my trusty Bowie knife. I didn't carry a gun, never really felt the need for one in these parts. Bears and cougars were rare, and a knife usually sufficed for protection. My team consisted of 3 other guys: Bob Murdoch, a burly ex-Marine with a knack for finding trails; Charlie Benson, a lean guy with the stamina of a marathon runner; and Eric Turner, the rookie, eager but green. We split into 2 groups. Bob and I took the northern route while Charlie and Eric headed south. We agreed to rendezvous at a clearing known as Pine Ridge by noon. It was a steep climb, and Bob and I pushed through, occasionally calling out Dave's name. By 10 a.m., we found our first clue: a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. It matched the description of the shirt Dave was wearing. We radioed Charlie and Eric, letting them know we might be onto something. As we moved deeper, the forest grew eerily quiet. Bob joked about how it felt like we were being watched. I laughed it off, but something about the silence didn't sit right with me. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon a small campsite. There were signs of a struggle: scattered gear, an overturned pot, and a bloodstain on the ground. It wasn't a lot, but enough to make my stomach churn. We called it in and started searching the area more thoroughly. Bob found a trail of blood drops leading away from the campsite. We followed it for about half a mile before the drops became smears and then disappeared altogether. It was close to noon, so we headed to Pine Ridge to meet up with Charlie and Eric. When we got there, Charlie was pacing, looking worried. Eric was missing. Charlie said they had found another clue: an abandoned backpack, but Eric had insisted on checking a nearby cave by himself and hadn't come back. We decided to check out the cave together. It wasn't far, maybe a 15-minute hike. The entrance was narrow, but we squeezed through, calling out for Eric. Inside, the cave was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. About 30 feet in, we found Eric. He was on the ground, unconscious but breathing. He had a nasty gash on his head, and his radio was smashed. Bob and I lifted him while Charlie kept an eye out for any signs of what had attacked him. We couldn't be sure if he had fallen or if something else had happened. We made a makeshift stretcher and began the slow trek back to the nearest ranger station. It was a grueling hike, especially with Eric's added weight. We had to move carefully, but we made decent time, arriving just before dark. Eric was rushed to the hospital. The rest of us regrouped to plan our next move. With one man down, the search for Dave took on a new sense of urgency. The blood and the struggle at the campsite indicated he was in serious trouble. The next day, we brought in reinforcements, a few more guys from the county, and a couple of volunteers who knew the area well. We divided into 3 groups and spread out. My group focused on the area around the cave, combing through every inch. Around mid-morning, we found another clue: Dave's pocket knife, half buried in the dirt. The blade was bent, and the handle was sticky with what looked like blood. It was a bad sign, but it also meant we were close. We pushed forward, following a faint trail through the underbrush. The forest was thick, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. That's when we heard it: a low, guttural noise that sent shivers down my spine. Bob, who was leading, froze and motioned for us to stop. The noise came again, closer this time. We crouched, peering through the foliage. In the dim light, we could make out a shape moving among the trees. It was large, hulking, and definitely not human. Bob whispered for us to back away slowly, but just as we started to retreat, the thing charged. It barreled through the underbrush with terrifying speed. Bob managed to get off a shot with his flare gun, the bright light momentarily blinding it. We ran. The thing roared, an awful, bone-chilling sound, and gave chase. We scattered, each of us sprinting in different directions. I didn't look back, just ran as fast as I could, branches whipping at my face. I stumbled into a clearing, panting and trying to catch my breath. The forest was silent again, except for my own ragged breathing. I had no idea where the others were or if they had made it out. My radio was still working, so I called for backup, giving them my coordinates. I heard rustling behind me and spun around, my knife at the ready. It was Bob, limping but alive. He had a deep gash on his leg, but he was grinning, relieved to see me. We didn't have time to chat. We needed to get back to the ranger station. The trek back was agonizingly slow, with Bob barely able to walk. I had to support most of his weight. but we made it. The others were already there, battered but alive. Charlie had a broken arm and one of the volunteers was missing, presumably taken by the creature. We radioed for more help and set up a perimeter around the station. It was going to be a long night. We took turns keeping watch, guns and flares at the ready. The creature didn't come that night, but we could hear it in the distance, its haunting cries echoing through the forest. By morning, reinforcements arrived. They brought heavier firepower and more men. We went back into the forest, determined to find Dave and put an end to whatever was out there. It took 2 more days of relentless searching before we found him. Dave's body was in a small ravine, covered in scratches and bite marks. He had put up a fight, but he didn't stand a chance against the creature. We radioed it in and carefully carried his body back to the station. The authorities were called and the area was closed off. They conducted an investigation, but officially they never found the creature. Unofficially, they told us it was likely a bear, though none of us believed it. Bears didn't move like that, didn't hunt like that. Eric recovered from his injuries but never came back to search and rescue. Charlie took a desk job and Bob retired early. As for me, I stayed on, but I never went back to that part of the forest. There are places in this world that are best left alone, and that was one of them. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear its cries in my dreams. And I know that out there, in those dark woods, something waits. The Great Smoky Mountains had always been a dream destination, a place of beauty, solitude, and isolation where I could lose myself in the woods and maybe find myself again. After the breakup with Eric, I needed an escape, something to remind me that I was capable, that I could handle life on my own. Mark, of course, wouldn't let me do it alone. My brother insisted on coming along, and with him came Na, his bubbly girlfriend, and Lucas, a friend of his who seemed more interested in me than the mountains. The whole trip was supposed to be a solo adventure, but I caved. I figured I could handle them for a weekend. We set out early on Friday, and the trailhead was already buzzing with tourists, their laughter filling the crisp morning air. Mark led the way, checking his map obsessively while lugging around half a camping store's worth of gear. He liked to over-prepare for everything. Na, naturally cheerful, hummed some pop song as she skipped along behind him. Lucas stuck close to me, his jokes falling flat and his flirtations rolling off me like water on rock. I was there for the hike. The Smokies were breathtaking. The way the mist clung to the rolling hills, the distant sound of water rushing through the trees, the deep green of the pines and ferns that hugged the path. If I could just let myself melt into that wilderness, I thought I might forget the reason I came here in the first place. But that sense of peace didn't last long. By the time we reached the more remote trail where we planned to camp, the crowds had thinned out. It was just us, and I was grateful for the quiet, at least at first. But as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, a strange heaviness settled over the forest. The cheerful calls of birds disappeared, replaced by an eerie stillness. "Something feels off," I said, mostly to myself. "You're just not used to the quiet," Lucas replied, a grin plastered on his face. "This is the best part, just us and the wild." I nodded, but couldn't shake the sensation. As we set up camp, Mark was his usual methodical self, making sure the tents were positioned perfectly and ensuring the fire pit was well constructed. Meanwhile, Lucas's tent wouldn't stay upright. The poles sagged despite his best efforts. Na laughed at his struggle, but I could sense the rising frustration. "You didn't exactly bring a 5-star hotel, huh?" she teased. I didn't blame her for laughing. Lucas's tent was a joke, but when the wind picked up later that night, it was less funny. The flimsy thing shook and collapsed in on him. Halfway through dinner, Mark offered to help him fix it, but Lucas waved him off. "I'll manage," he muttered, clearly embarrassed. I felt a twinge of guilt, but the night was closing in fast, and we all needed rest. We sat around the fire, the woods around us thick with shadows. The Smokies, which had seemed so beautiful just hours earlier, now felt ominous. We were miles from the nearest ranger station, out of cell service, with nothing but trees and mountains for company. And then, just as we were beginning to relax, we heard it, a distant scream. It was high-pitched, echoing through the valley. It wasn't human, but it wasn't quite animal either. The sound made my skin crawl. "Cougar," Mark said, but he didn't sound convinced. Yeah, right, Lucas scoffed, throwing another log on the fire. That's the Wampus cat. He grinned, as if he'd just cracked some hilarious joke, but no one laughed. I hadn't grown up around here, but I knew enough about Appalachian folklore to recognize the name. The Wampus cat was the stuff of campfire stories, half woman, half beast, cursed to stalk the woods and hunt down anyone who ventured too far from civilization. Don't joke about that, Na said, her voice wavering. People say they've seen it. Mark, ever the pragmatist, rolled his eyes. It's just a legend, probably an owl or something. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The fire cast long shadows, and every crack of a twig in the distance made my heart skip. I wrapped my arms around my knees, trying to focus on the warmth of the fire and Na's cheerful chatter, but the unease settled deep into my bones. When I went to bed that night, I couldn't sleep. Every rustle of leaves outside my tent sounded too close. I kept thinking about that scream and the way it had seemed to echo from all directions. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next day, the tension between us started to show. Mark was irritable, frustrated that we weren't sticking to his planned itinerary. Na tried to keep the mood light, but her jokes felt forced. Lucas was quieter than usual, as though the previous night's collapse of his tent had deflated his bravado. It didn't help that the wildlife we encountered seemed wrong. Deer stood unnaturally still, watching us with glassy eyes. We came across a black bear in the distance, and instead of lumbering away as they usually do, it stood on its hind legs, staring at us for far too long. I didn't mention it to the others, but I noticed that every time we passed an animal, it was facing us, not the other way around. They're just curious, Mark said when I finally pointed it out, but I wasn't so sure. By the time we made it back to camp that evening, a low fog had settled in around the trees, shrouding everything in a thick, wet blanket. My unease from the night before returned, stronger than ever. I set my gear down near the fire pit and wandered toward the edge of camp, drawn to the stillness that felt too unnatural. As I stood there scanning the woods, something moved in the distance. At first, it was just a shadow, a blur of movement between the trees. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I saw it again. Something humanoid, but not quite. It was tall, hunched, and moved with a feline grace. For a split second, I swore I saw glowing yellow eyes staring back at me from the shadows. Hannah? I jumped, startled by Mark's voice. Yeah? I lied, turning back to the fire, but I kept looking over my shoulder, searching the tree line for any sign of the creature. Nothing. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. That night, the woods came alive with sound. The same scream echoed through the trees, but this time it was closer, louder. I could hear branches snapping in the distance, or something big moving through the underbrush. Na woke with a start, her eyes wide with fear. Mark, she whispered, shaking him awake. Something's out there. Lucas sat up too, his face pale in the firelight. It's the Wampus cat, he said, but this time there was no humor in his voice. I glanced at Mark, hoping for some reassurance, but even he looked rattled. We need to stay together, Mark said, his voice low and steady. Whatever it is, it's probably just curious. Let's not provoke it. But as the night wore on, the sounds grew closer. Branches breaking, heavy footsteps circling our camp. I gripped the camping knife I kept in my pack, my hands slick with sweat. The fire crackled weakly, its light barely piercing the thick fog that had rolled in again. And then it attacked. It happened so fast. 1 minute, we were huddled around the fire, and the next, something lunged from the shadows, knocking Lucas off his feet. He screamed, scrambling to get away, but the creature, whatever it was, slashed at him with claws I could barely see. Blood sprayed across the campsite, dark and viscous in the firelight. Run, Mark shouted, grabbing Na and pulling her toward the trail, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the thing that had attacked Lucas. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. Half human, half mountain lion, its eyes glowing yellow as it crouched over him, growling low in its throat. Hannah! Mark yelled again, and that snapped me out of it. I ran. The four of us tore through the woods, barely able to see the trail in the thick fog. I could hear Lucas behind us, his footsteps growing fainter, his breath ragged. The Wampus cat was toying with us, letting us run, letting us think we had a chance. It let out another ear-piercing scream, and I knew it was coming for us. We need to stop it, I gasped, my lungs burning as I struggled to keep up with Mark and Na. Fire. Mark glanced back at me, his face pale with fear. It's scared of fire. We can't stop now, I said, but we didn't have a choice. The Wampus cat was right behind us, its footsteps growing louder, closer. I could see the glow of its eyes through the trees, the way it moved, darting between the shadows. We reached the edge of a clearing and Mark stopped dead in his tracks. Hannah, light it. Light everything. I fumbled with the matches in my pack, my hands shaking. We piled everything we had, gear, clothes, food, into a makeshift bonfire and lit it. The flames roared to life, casting long shadows across the clearing. For a moment, the Wampus cat hesitated, its eyes reflecting the firelight. It circled the edge of the clearing, growling low in its throat, but it didn't come closer. We stood there, panting, watching as the creature melted back into the shadows, its eyes the last thing to disappear. We stayed there until dawn, huddled around the fire, too scared to move. Lucas never caught up. By morning, we were exhausted, bloodied, and broken, but we were alive. We never found Lucas's body. Mark didn't talk about what happened, and Na didn't speak much either. We made it back to the ranger station where they told us we'd probably been attacked by a bear, but I knew better. The Wampus cat was real, and it was still out there waiting for its next victim. My name is Gage Gibson, and back in 2023, I drove my RV up to the remote corners of the Tongass National Forest in Alaska. I've always found peace among the cedars and hemlocks, a far cry from the spreadsheets and conference calls that usually consume my life. After years of crunching numbers as an actuary, I decided I deserved a break. A real one this time, not just a weekend binge-watching documentaries about places I'd rather be. So I packed up my RV with enough supplies to last a month, figuring that some solitude might help me reset. Besides, what's the worst that could happen in the great outdoors? It's just trees and squirrels, right? The drive up was breathtaking. Glaciers glinted under the sun, and the air was so crisp it felt like inhaling pure clarity. I set up camp near a serene lake, its surface so still it looked like a giant mirror reflecting the endless sky. The nearest town was miles away, and that was exactly the point. On my second day, I decided to try my hand at fishing. Armed with a brand new rod that still had the price tag dangling from it, I headed to the lake. Casting the line, I felt a strange sense of accomplishment. That is, until I realized I'd forgotten bait. Well, Albert, you're a real catch, I chuckled to myself. Dark humor was always my go-to, even when the joke was on me. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, I heard rustling from the tree line. Probably just a deer or maybe a particularly clumsy squirrel. Ignoring it, I continued my futile fishing attempt. The rustling grew louder, and curiosity got the better of me. I turned around, half expecting to see some wildlife ready to mock my angling skills. Instead, I saw a man emerging from the shadows. He was tall and lean, wearing a tattered flannel shirt and jeans stained with what looked like mud or something else. His beard was unkempt, and his eyes had a wild glint to them. "Evening," he rasped. "Hey there," I replied, trying to sound casual while every instinct screamed at me to be on guard. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" He didn't answer, just stared at me for an uncomfortably long time. "You alone out here?" he finally asked. "Just me and the fish that refused to be caught?" I said with a weak laugh. "You from around here?" He took a few steps closer. "You could say that. These woods have been my home for as long as I can remember. Must know all the best spots then? Any tips for a novice fisherman?" I was aiming for friendly banter, but his demeanor was as cold as the Alaskan ice. He smirked. "Sometimes it's not about catching fish. Sometimes it's about not being caught yourself." "That's one way to look at it," I mumbled. "Well, I should probably head back to my RV before it gets too dark." He nodded slowly. "Smart move. Nights can get dangerous around here." I gathered my things and made a brisk walk back to the campsite, feeling his gaze piercing the back of my head the entire way. Back at the RV, I locked the doors and windows, a sudden urgency gripping me. Maybe isolation wasn't all it was cracked up to be. That night, sleep evaded me. Every creak of the RV seemed amplified. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate steps crunching the fallen leaves. Peering through the small window, I saw nothing but darkness. Then a whisper echoed, barely audible but unmistakable. Albert. My heart pounded. How did he know my name? I was sure I hadn't mentioned it. Grabbing the nearest thing that could serve as a weapon, a cast iron skillet, I stood by the door, muscles tense. Minutes passed, and the footsteps faded away. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, solitude can do that, right? I convinced myself it was the wind and finally drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I decided to move camp. As I packed up, I noticed something chilling. Footprints circling the RV. They were deep and erratic, as if someone had been pacing all night. A shiver ran down my spine. Diving further into the forest, I found a new spot near a flowing river. The sound of the water was soothing, and I felt a bit more at ease. Determined not to let one odd encounter ruin my trip, I went for a hike, taking in the majestic beauty around me. About an hour into the trail, I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin. Curiosity nudged me forward. The door was ajar, and the interior was as grim as you'd expect. Rusted tools, a rickety table, and walls adorned with deep scratch marks. Then I saw it, a bulletin board plastered with newspaper clippings. Stepping closer, I read the headlines. Missing hikers baffle authorities. Unsolved murders plague Tongass Forest. Local man suspected but never charged. Beneath the clippings were photographs, candid shots of people who, judging by the dates, had vanished over the past decade. My blood ran cold when I saw a freshly pinned photo of me fishing by the lake. A floorboard creaked behind me. Spinning around, skillet raised, I faced the man from last night. "I see you found my little gallery," he said, a sinister grin spreading across his face. "What is this?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Memories," he replied. "Trophies of my time spent with visitors like you." I edged toward the door, but he blocked my path. Now, leaving so soon? We haven't even started." Without thinking, I swung the skillet. It connected with his shoulder, and he let out a grunt, not of pain, but of amusement. "Feisty one, aren't you?" He lunged at me, and we both crashed onto the splintered floor. The skillet slipped from my grasp, his hands wrapped around my throat, his grip tightening. Spots danced before my eyes as I struggled beneath his weight. Desperate, my fingers searched the floor until they closed around a shard of glass from a broken picture frame. Summoning every ounce of strength, I drove it into his arm. He howled, recoiling just enough for me to shove him off. Gasping for air, I scrambled to my feet and bolted out the door. The dense forest that once felt like a sanctuary now seemed like a maze designed to trap me. Branches tore at my clothes as I raced through the underbrush. Behind me, his footsteps pounded, getting closer. "You can't run forever," he shouted. "Watch me." I yelled back, adrenaline fueling my escape. Bursting into a clearing, I spotted another RV parked near a makeshift campsite. 2 hikers were preparing lunch, oblivious to the chaos unfolding. "Help! He's trying to kill me!" I screamed. They looked up, confusion turning to alarm as they saw the blood on my neck and the terror in my eyes. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard, stood up. "What the hell is going on?" Before I could answer, the maniac emerged from the trees. "He's crazy!" I shouted. "He's killed people!" The burly man squared his shoulders. "Buddy, you need to back off." The killer sneered. "This doesn't concern you." "Like hell it doesn't," the second hiker, a woman with sharp eyes, said as she reached into their RV and pulled out a flare gun. "Leave now or we'll make you." For a moment, the killer assessed the situation. Then, with a twisted smile, he retreated into the woods. "This isn't over, Albert," he called out before disappearing among the trees. My knees buckled and I collapsed to the ground. The couple rushed over. "You're safe now," the woman assured me. "Let's get you inside and clean you up." Inside their RV, I recounted everything between gulps of water. They introduced themselves as Victor and Alina, seasoned campers who had been exploring the Alaskan wilderness for years. "We've heard rumors about people going missing," Victor said grimly, "but we never thought." "We need to contact the authorities," Alina insisted. "There's no signal out here," Victor replied. "We'll have to drive to the nearest ranger station." A sudden thud against the side of the RV silenced us. The window shattered as rocks came crashing through. "He's back," I shouted. Victor grabbed a hunting knife from his pack. "Stay here," he ordered. "Are you insane?" Elena hissed. "We need to stay together." Another rock smashed through, narrowly missing Elena's head. "We can't just sit here," Victor argued. "He's trying to flush us out." I realized we needed to make a run for it. Gathering what we could, we dashed out of the RV and headed toward Victor and Elena's truck. As we ran, the killer appeared, brandishing an axe with bloodstains that hinted at its grim history. He charged at us, and Victor met him head-on. The two grappled, the axe swinging dangerously close. "Go!" Victor shouted at us. Elena hesitated. "I'm not leaving you." "Elena, we have to help him," I urged. She nodded, and together we searched for anything that could tip the scales. Spotting a fallen branch, I picked it up and swung at the killer, striking his back. He stumbled, giving Victor the opening he needed to plunge the knife into the attacker's side. The killer let out an agonized scream, but didn't go down. Instead, he turned his fury toward me. Before he could advance, Elena fired the flare gun. The flare struck his chest, igniting his shirt. Flames licked up his torso as he thrashed wildly. "Let's go," Victor yelled. We didn't need to be told twice. Piling into the truck, we sped off, the figure of the burning man shrinking in the rearview mirror. The road was rough, but Victor navigated it with practiced skill. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the ranger station. Bursting inside, we relayed our harrowing tale to the stunned officers. They immediately dispatched a team to investigate. Days later, the authorities confirmed our account. They found the charred remains of the cabin and unearthed shallow graves nearby, each containing the remains of missing hikers and campers. The media dubbed the killer the Tongass Phantom, a predator who had eluded capture for years. In the aftermath, I learned more about him. His name was Silas Crow, a former wilderness guide who went off the grid after a personal tragedy twisted his psyche. He believed the forest was his domain and that anyone who entered was fair game. The realization that I had narrowly escaped a serial killer was sobering. Victor and Elena became unexpected friends, bonded by the ordeal. We promised to keep in touch, perhaps meet again under less terrifying circumstances. As for me, I returned to my life with a newfound appreciation for the mundane. The spreadsheets didn't seem so suffocating anymore. Yet every so often, when I catch a whiff of pine or hear the rustle of leaves, I'm reminded of that fateful trip to the Tongass National Forest and the man who believed he owned it. I didn't believe in ghosts, UFOs, or anything supernatural. I spent most of my career chasing down so-called paranormal phenomena and explaining them with cold, hard facts. That was my job, turning superstition into science, myths into measurable data. The Brown Mountain Lights? They were just another mystery waiting for a rational explanation. That's what I told myself as I drove my RV up the winding roads of Pisgah National Forest. The thick trees closed in on either side. The air was crisp, and autumn leaves scattered across the path. There was a quiet stillness that made the world feel far away. I should have felt excited even, but as the sun began to sink behind the distant ridges, leaving the forest bathed in shadow, I felt something else. Tension. Shaking it off, I parked the RV at the remote campsite I'd scouted. This was supposed to be a solo trip, a few days to get up close and personal with the Brown Mountain Lights. Interview locals, take readings, and prove once and for all that the lights were nothing more than atmospheric conditions or optical illusions. I had all the gear I'd need: high-resolution cameras, thermal scanners, EMF detectors, the works. I wasn't expecting to find anything supernatural, just an anomaly, and anomalies had explanations. But the moment I stepped out of the RV, a chill ran through me. The trees rustled softly, as if whispering some secret I wasn't meant to hear. "Focus," I muttered to myself, dragging my gear out and setting up the cameras, angling them toward Brown Mountain Ridge. I had a perfect view of the ridge from my campsite, miles away but clear in the distance. That's where the lights were supposed to appear. By the time I was fully settled in, I was sitting outside the RV, bundled in a jacket, sipping coffee, and staring out into the dark, waiting. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just stillness. Then, around midnight, I saw them. At first they were faint, flickering, small orbs of light hovering just above the ridge. I squinted, adjusting the focus on my binoculars. There they were. 3 lights bobbing in the air like they were floating on an invisible current. I grabbed my camera, flipping the switch to start recording, but nothing happened. The lens stayed black. The screen, dead. "What the hell?" I muttered, fiddling with the buttons. Fully charged and brand new, The camera shouldn't have malfunctioned. I checked the battery, clicked it back into place, and tried again. Still nothing. Frustration surged through me. This was exactly what I'd come here for. The lights, right there in front of me, and I couldn't even capture them. I stood up, grabbing my thermal scanner, but when I flipped it on, the screen flickered, then went dark. "Come on," I whispered, trying to stay calm. The gear wasn't cheap, and none of it should have been failing, but it was, piece by piece. The lights danced on the ridge, growing brighter, closer. My heart raced. I wasn't scared, I told myself. I was just annoyed. The logical part of my brain struggled to make sense of it. Maybe the electronics were glitching because of interference, some kind of electromagnetic field or something. I took a deep breath, trying to settle my nerves. But the lights, those strange pulsing orbs, kept moving, almost as if they were drifting toward me. The air turned cold. So cold that I could see my breath misting in front of my face. A thin layer of frost started forming on the ground, on the RV windows, on my gear. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my hands beginning to stiffen in the chill. It didn't make sense. The weather forecast had called for a cool night, but nothing like this. I checked my phone's temperature app. 30-degree Fahrenheit? Impossible. I glanced at my surroundings, feeling the silence close in around me. Then I noticed the lights were no longer on the ridge. They were much closer now, floating just above the treetops, flickering like distant fireflies, but larger. Too large. I watched, heart pounding as they bobbed and weaved. Their glow cast long shadows on the ground. I pulled out my phone to take a video. The screen flashed, then went black. It wouldn't turn on. Frustration boiled over. I slammed the phone down on the camping table. It bounced. I stood there, fists clenched, trying to keep my cool. This was why people got sucked into believing nonsense, because technology failed at the worst possible moment. The lights weren't supernatural. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the cold was messing with the equipment or some kind of atmospheric distortion. But then I saw the handprints. Small, faint handprints etched in frost on the RV window. They hadn't been there before. I knew that. I stared at them, my breath catching in my throat. They looked like the handprints of a child, no more than a few inches across, and they were slowly, gradually melting away in the cold. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. I turned to look at the lights, now hovering at the edge of the forest, close enough that I could make out their eerie bluish glow. They flickered in the trees, moving in slow, lazy circles, as if they were watching me, waiting for me. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was impossible. There was no way the lights could have traveled that fast. No way they could be this close. I'd seen videos, read reports. They were always distant, spectral, unreachable. But now they felt personal, as if they were beckoning me. I swallowed, my throat tight. Without thinking, I took a step forward. The cold deepened, pressing in on me from all sides. The frost crept up the sides of the RV, spreading like delicate veins. The temperature continued to drop. My breath came out in ragged gasps, and my vision blurred. The lights drifted deeper into the trees, flickering and glowing, moving in a pattern that felt deliberate, like they wanted me to follow. And I did. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling as I made my way toward the forest's edge. The beam of light was weak, barely cutting through the dark. I kept my eyes on the lights, feeling a strange pull in my chest, like something was urging me forward. As I entered the trees, the world grew darker. The lights danced just out of reach, always a few steps ahead of me, their glow casting an ethereal light on the twisted branches. The forest felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. I checked my watch. 2 hours had passed. I hadn't even noticed. My legs ached, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no idea how far I'd wandered. The lights flickered again, brightening as they circled a large boulder ahead, and then they stopped, hovering there, motionless. I took a step closer, and that's when the hallucinations began. Shapes. Faint figures moving in the trees, shadows stretching unnaturally long, and there between the branches I saw faces. Pale, expressionless faces staring at me with hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. Panic set in. I turned to leave, but the forest had shifted. The path I'd taken was no longer clear. Everything looked the same trees, the same twisting branches. The lights pulsed behind me, glowing brighter as if taunting me. I ran. My breath came in short bursts. My heart raced in my chest as I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to find my way back to the campsite. The lights flickered at the corners of my vision, but I ignored them. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Light, quick footsteps crunching through the frost behind me. I didn't dare look back. I ran faster, my flashlight flickering and dying in my hand. I broke through the tree line, gasping for air, and saw the RV ahead, a welcome sight. But the air around it was colder than ever. The frost was so thick on the windows that it looked like snow. And there, pressed against the glass, were more handprints. Dozens of them. I scrambled inside, locking the door behind me, and collapsed on the floor, panting. My entire body trembled with cold and fear. The lights were still out there. I could see them through the frosted windows, flickering in the trees, growing fainter as the night wore on. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. By dawn, they were gone. The temperature returned to normal, and the frost melted away. But I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. I packed up the RV and drove out of Pisgah National Forest, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I'd come here to find an explanation, to debunk the Brown Mountain Lights. But what I found was something else. Something I couldn't explain. And I knew, deep down, that the lights weren't just a phenomenon. They were something more. Something ancient. Something dangerous. Something that had almost taken me. I don't know what they wanted, but I'll never go back to find out. My name is Neo Cooper, and back in 2020, I took my trusty RV to Canyonlands National Park in Utah to get away from it all. I've always been more comfortable navigating back roads than office politics, which might explain why my career as a freelance photographer has more free than Lance in it. So there I was, chasing the horizon with nothing but red rocks and open skies ahead. The road was my canvas, and I was ready to paint with the colors of the desert sunset. I'd packed enough canned beans and bad coffee to last a week, longer if I could tolerate my own cooking. As I rolled into a secluded spot near the edge of a mesa, I couldn't help but chuckle at a sign I read, "No outlet." Story of my life, I thought. Setting up camp was a breeze. I parked the RV facing west to catch the evening light and set out a chair to soak in the view. The silence was profound, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of the wind and my stomach reminding me that beans weren't a food group. While fumbling with a can opener, a device clearly designed to test human patience, I noticed another RV parked about 100 yards away. It was a vintage Airstream, polished to a shine. Looked like someone cared more about their vehicle than I did about my entire wardrobe. "Nice rig," I shouted, waving. A man stepped out, gave a polite nod, but didn't say anything. Tall guy, broad shoulders, wearing a hat that shadowed his face. Well, so much for neighborly chats. The first night was uneventful, which, in my book, is a good thing. I spent it trying to capture star trails with my camera, though I probably ended up with more photos of my thumb than the Milky Way. I turned in late, the kind of tired that makes even an RV bed feel like a luxury mattress. The next morning, I decided to go for a hike to scout some photo spots. I packed my gear, slapped on some sunscreen, because lobster red is not my color, and headed toward a canyon that looked promising. As I passed by the Airstream, I noticed the man from before sitting outside whittling a piece of wood. Up close, he had a rugged face, the kind that had seen more sunrises than I'd had hot meals. "Morning," I offered. He looked up, eyes a shade of gray that matched the storm clouds gathering in the distance. "Stay on the marked trails," he said flatly. "Will do," I replied, trying to keep things light. "Wouldn't want to get lost and have to eat cactus for dinner." He didn't laugh. Tough crowd. Shrugging it off, I continued on my way. The landscape was breathtaking, towering sandstone formations, narrow slot canyons, and the kind of silence that makes you check if your ears are working. I set up my tripod near a particularly dramatic vista and lost track of time as I snapped away. On the way back, I noticed something odd, a series of deep grooves in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged. They led off the trail and disappeared behind a rocky outcrop. Curiosity may have killed the cat, but satisfaction brought it back, right? I followed the marks, navigating through shrubs and over rocks. As I rounded the bend, the smell hit me. Metallic, pungent. Then I saw it. A large, dark stain on the ground and what looked like torn fabric caught on a nearby branch. My heart did a somersault. This wasn't the scenic detour I signed up for. I snapped a few photos, not out of morbid fascination, but instinct. Evidence, I told myself. Maybe someone's injured and needs help. Heading back to the main trail, I nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard footsteps behind me. It was the man from the Airstream. "You're off the trail," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "Yeah, sorry, I thought I saw something." "You shouldn't be here." He stepped closer and I noticed a dark smudge on his sleeve. "Is that paint?" I asked, pointing. He glanced down. "Had an accident." "Right, well, I'll just get back then." I tried to move past him, but he blocked my path. "Delete the photos," he demanded. "Excuse me?" "You took pictures. Delete them." Alarm bells rang louder than a Monday morning alarm clock. "They're just landscapes," I lied. He reached into his pocket and I caught a glimpse of something metallic. This was officially above my pay grade. "Okay, look," I stammered. "If this is about trespassing, I'm sorry. No need to make a federal case out of it." "Delete the photos," he repeated, stepping closer. I weighed my options, comply or make a run for it. Given that my cardio was limited to sprinting for the microwave before my popcorn burned, running wasn't ideal. "Fine," I said, pulling out my camera. I fumbled with the settings, pretending to navigate to the delete menu. In a split second, I swung the camera up and blinded him with a flash, then took off like a rabbit on espresso. Behind me, I heard a curse and the sound of pursuit. Adrenaline is a funny thing. It turns out when you're running for your life, you discover muscles you didn't know you had. I zigzagged through the terrain, hoping to lose him among the rocks. My RV wasn't far. I just had to make it there. Bursting into the clearing, I risked a glance back. He was nowhere in sight. I dashed into the RV and locked the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Grabbing my keys, I fumbled to start the engine. Nothing, not even a click. "Come on, don't do this to me now," I yelled, as if shouting at the dashboard would help. Then I saw it. The engine cover inside the cabin was ajar, wires dangling like mechanical entrails. Someone had sabotaged my RV. A knock on the door made me jump. "Open up," the man's voice called out calmly. "Yeah, sure. Let me get right on that," I muttered under my breath. Frantically, I looked for anything that could serve as a weapon. My options were limited. A frying pan, a can of beans, and a tripod. Grabbing the tripod, I extended it to its full length. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I shouted. "Too late for that," he replied. The windows. Why hadn't I thought of that? I moved to the side window and peered out. He was standing by the door, with something glinting in his hand. A knife. "Great, Logan," I whispered. "You wanted adventure. Next time, settle for a crossword puzzle." I remembered my phone and pulled it out. No signal, of course. I was in the middle of nowhere, and the only bars I had were the ones I wished were on the windows. The sound of metal scraping made my skin crawl. He was trying to pry the door open. Desperate, I recalled that the RV had a flare gun somewhere. Digging through a drawer, I found it alongside a packet of expired trail mix. I'd always thought the flare gun was overkill, but now I was grateful for my past self's paranoia. I positioned myself near the door, flare gun in one hand, tripod in the other. The door creaked as it gave way. He stepped inside, eyes scanning the interior. "Last chance," he said softly. Funny, I was about to tell him the same thing. "I was about to tell you the same thing," I retorted, aiming the flare gun at him. He smirked. "You think that'll stop me? Maybe not, but it'll definitely ruin your day." Without another word, he lunged at me. I fired. The flare hit him square in the chest, erupting in a blaze of light and heat. He screamed, a guttural sound that echoed in the confined space. Taking advantage of his distraction, I shoved past him and bolted out of the RV. Smoke billowed out behind me. I didn't look back. I sprinted toward the Airstream, reasoning that he might have a vehicle that actually worked. As I approached, the smell hit me, a mix of chemicals and something worse. Pushing the door open, I was unprepared for the sight inside. Barrels labeled with hazardous material signs lined the walls. On a table lay stacks of cash and packets of white powder. This guy wasn't just some random psycho. He was running a drug operation out here. Then I saw it, a satellite phone on the counter. Grabbing it, I dialed 911. Miraculously, it connected. 911, what's your emergency? "I'm at Yellowstone National Park. There's a man trying to kill me." A heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around to see his face, contorted with rage, burn marks across his chest. "Time to end this," he growled. He swung the knife, and I barely dodged, stumbling backward into the table. My hand landed on something cold, a wrench. Without thinking, I swung it upward, connecting with his jaw. He staggered but didn't go down. We grappled, knocking over barrels and scattering cash like confetti at a nightmare birthday party. He was strong, but adrenaline fueled my desperation. I managed to push him back against the shelf, which teetered and collapsed, burying him under containers. Not waiting to see if that held him, I bolted out of the airstream. In the distance, I heard sirens. Bless those park rangers and their prompt response times. I ran toward the sound, waving my arms like a madman. A ranger's vehicle came into view, and I felt a surge of relief. "Over here," I shouted. They pulled up, and 2 rangers jumped out. "What's going on?" one asked. "There's a man. He tried to kill me. He's back there." I pointed toward the airstream. As if on cue, flames burst from the RV. The whole thing was going up. "Stay here," one ranger ordered as they moved toward the fire. Minutes later, they returned. "We found a body," one said grimly. "Looks like he didn't make it out." I nodded, a whirlwind of emotions swirling but none settling. "He was running a drug operation," I said. "There are barrels, chemicals, money. We'll secure the area," the ranger assured me. "You're lucky to be alive." "Story of my life," I said with a weak smile. "Luck and a questionable sense of adventure." They took my statement, and as the adrenaline faded, exhaustion took over. They offered me a ride back to the nearest station. As we drove away, I couldn't help but think about how a quest for solitude had turned into a fight for survival. Later, I learned his name was Victor Delgado, a former chemist turned drug manufacturer. He'd been using the remote areas of the park to cook meth, staying under the radar. Anyone who stumbled upon his operation didn't live to tell the tale. Well, almost anyone. I guess sometimes being in the wrong place at the wrong time makes for a heck of a story. Just not one I plan to share on my next camping trip.